A Small Town Christmas Reunion by Melinda Curtis. Chapter 1. Vince Patrizio got out of his favorite sports car, a new red Ferrari, looked around the railroad stop retreat in Harmony Valley, a rundown two-story motel on a pine-filled mountaintop, spotted a small group decorating the exterior grounds, including his wife, the woman who'd bolted after they sealed their wedding vows nearly 12 years ago, and told Jill, not without some frustration, "You served me with divorce papers." Predictably, Jill took one look at Vince and hot-tailed it into the retreat's office, a separate structure that looked like a small house. Her exit coincided with the opening verse from the Chipmunks' Christmas Don't Be Late. Vince drew a calming breath. I should have anticipated this. Jill was a runner, always had been. Of all the things Vince loved about Jill, avoiding conflict wasn't one of them. With a nod to the Christmas decorating crew, all of whom he was familiar with, Vince headed toward the office. There would be time to talk to them later. But the crew wasn't to be put off. "Dad!" Teddy ran toward Vince, putting a hold on his plans. Jill's son was all smiles and gangly legs, tinsel mingled with his walnut-brown hair. "Are you here for Christmas, my son?" "I'm here." Vince smiled warmly, not entirely sure how to respond in more detail than that. Teddy was the reason Jill had proposed to Vince at the end of their senior year. Her date had drugged her on prom night, and Vince's fingers curled into fists. Jill hadn't told him the details, and he hadn't asked, because while their teenage friendship had bloomed in the year they'd gone to school together in Las Vegas, he'd fallen in love with her. Marry Jill? Heck yeah. Be a father to her unborn child? Absolutely. He'd eagerly stood with Jill at the altar in Vegas, ready to create the safe, loving family unit he'd never been a part of. And when the wedding vows were finished, when he'd received the invitation to kiss his bride, Vince had taken Jill into his arms and kissed her the way a man kisses the woman he's lucky enough to spend the rest of his life with. And wonder of wonders, she'd kissed him back, as if she felt the same way. For a brief moment, everything in Vince's life was the way it was supposed to be. But after the kiss was over, when they'd stared into each other's eyes for a handful of heartbeats, after that, Jill ran, taking his ring, his name, and his heart with her. And although Vince had kept tabs on Jill from afar for over a decade, he hadn't seen or talked to her until a few weeks ago. She'd asked him to meet her at the funeral of Brian Salazar, the man who'd drugged her and gotten her pregnant. Grieving, Brian's family had wanted to meet his child. Scheming, they'd wanted to establish their rights to a relationship with Teddy, despite the crime that had created him. They'd had a lawyer present to press the point home at their son's funeral. It was then that Vince learned it wasn't the first time the Salazars had tried to lay claim to the boy. They'd offered Jill money to give up her son before she'd even given birth. Imagine that. The slimy Salazars were the reason Jill had proposed to Vince. Without a second thought, Vince had lived up to his wedding vows at that funeral and told those vipers that Teddy was his son. Lacking distinctive features, they looked enough alike to pull it off. Teddy's dark brown hair to Vince's black, Teddy's dark brown eyes to Vince's black. But the Salazars weren't easily scared off. Their lawyers were taking this to court. Jill still needed the protection and power of Vince's family. His grandfather owned a large, luxury casino on the Vegas Strip, the Bella Vista. They had a team of cutthroat lawyers. Jill still needs me, if only for legal reasons. Ignoring her situation wasn't an option. Running away wasn't an option. Divorce wasn't an option. Me. I'm her best option. "Dad?" Teddy stood before Vince, smile falling into a look of uncertainty since Vince hadn't greeted him with more than 2 words. Having only met at Brian's funeral, the boy had every right to feel insecure. They didn't know each other. But that's going to change. Vince shoved urgency and exhaustion to the back of his mind. In his desire to get to Harmony Valley, he hadn't slept in over 24 hours. But this boy, my son, he reminded himself, needed a proper father figure. And fast, in case the court requested Teddy appear in court. Vince laid a hand on the boy's shoulder, trying to put him at ease. "Teddy, I bet you're trying to decide if we should hug, shake hands, or acknowledge each other with a nod." Despite his best intentions, Vince's gaze strayed to the office and its big front window. A Christmas tree with white blinking lights obstructed his view of the interior. He didn't know if Jill was inside watching or not, but he did know that didn't matter. Teddy was his. It was far past time that Vince proved that to everyone, and made this marriage real. Vince returned his attention to Teddy. "What do you think we should do?" Teddy regarded Vince with a serious expression, Vince normally associated with a much older soul. This boy has been through something that chipped away at his innocence. Vince could relate. His childhood hadn't been idyllic either. Teddy needs me too. Vince picked the tinsel from Teddy's hair as he waited for the boy's answer. He tucked the glittery strands in the pocket of his dress slacks. Teddy wore a black hoodie imprinted with the words, "Railroad Stop Retreat." It was too big for his slight frame. His blue jeans were too short for his long legs. His feet were too large for his body. Here was a boy in the midst of a growth spurt. Soon, he'd be a tall teenager in need of a father figure, an ever-present father figure. "When we first met, we shook hands," Teddy said slowly, referring to Brian's funeral. "But I still don't know why you haven't been around and—" "A fist bump, then." Vince extended his knuckles. "It's not as formal as a handshake and not as familiar as a hug." Teddy looked relieved as he tapped his knuckles to Vince's. "Nice. You'll get your answers," Vince promised him, "as soon as I get mine." Vince took another step forward, only to be waylaid by a small family unit, all of whom wore blue jeans and the same black hoodie with the retreat's name on it. "Your car is red like Christmas?" Little blonde Maddie spoke first, her hands full of the tinsel she'd been layering on an outdoor fir tree when Vince drove up. She was 6, a numbers whiz, and possibly the reason for the tinsel Vince had removed from Teddy's hair. "There are 9 letters in Christmas." Maddie proceeded to spell the word while counting the letters on her fingers. "Smart girl." Vince hadn't been around many kids. He patted her on top of her golden head and tried to ease past. Sam thwarted his progress next, enveloping Vince in a bear hug. Vince wasn't a hugger by nature, but he and Sam were best friends. They'd served in the Marines together, taken enemy bullets on the same day from kids barely older than Teddy, and spent the past few years leaning on each other, confiding in each other, prodding each other to get well. Vince with his bullet-riddled limp. Sam with his kid-triggered PTSD. Lately, they'd both been doing better. Case in point, Sam was interacting with both Teddy and Maddie, and he didn't look pale, stumble, or pass out. As for Vince, his limp was never going away, but with exercise and a weight regimen, it was practically impossible to notice. I hope anyway. When Sam was done pounding Vince's back, the taller man released Vince, dark eyes taking inventory. "This is a surprise. I was just on the phone with your grandfather. Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" "I didn't realize it myself until last night." Vince had been served divorce papers late, got in his car, and driven straight from Las Vegas to Harmony Valley, California, a place he'd never been but checked on regularly because this little place was where Jill had run to after their wedding ceremony. She had family here, including her cousin Annie, Sam's fiancée. Annie moved into Vince's way next, her short, wispy blonde hair fluttering in the chill, late-afternoon breeze. Her hug was brief, awkward even. Then Annie fixed Vince with a searching stare. "Are you going to need a place to stay?" "I hope not." But there'd been those divorce papers. Vince glanced toward the small house containing the retreat office in what looked like a former single-car garage. Why? Divorce after 11 years, 7 months, and 3 days of marriage? Yep, he'd counted. He'd driven 15 hours over some of the most boring highways Nevada and California had to offer. What else was he going to do but look back on the mess he and Jill had created of their lives? Of our chance at true love. "My dad is staying with us," Teddy said to Annie with a mixture of pride and possessiveness. "Because we're family." Vince nodded. "That's right, we're family." He broke free of his welcome party and went off to find his wife, and somehow proved just that. Jill stood behind the check-in counter, trying to compose herself for the confrontation with Vince, reminding herself to be firm. I can't let this marriage go on. She'd used Vince long enough. She had to cut him loose, the way she had her parents when she bought this place from them. Jill stared about the office, at beige walls with framed photographs of family and the retreat when it was new in the 1960s. At the scuffed wooden floors and the pink Formica counters, At the 5-foot-tall Christmas tree decorated with lights and trains, and the wreath decorated with gold ribbon that hung from the inside of the front door. And she tried to think about her plans for renovation and upgrades. If only memories weren't slinging themselves to the forefront of her mind like chunks of ice in a hailstorm. Those memories chipped away at her resolve. Those memories, there were just 2 vivid ones, and both of them were when Vince had kissed her. Movement outside the office drew her gaze. Vince approached, strides nearly disguising his limp. He wore black slacks, a white dress shirt, and shiny leather loafers. No jacket or sweatshirt warded off the December mountain chill. His black eyes were a little too discerning to fit small-town Harmony Valley. His black hair was a little too long to fit the corporate mold. He always looked out of place standing next to me. Too sophisticated, too controlled, too smart. That's how she'd thought of him all these years. A man who was too much, a man who was out of her league. Because if Jill dwelled on their wedding kiss, I will not think about kisses, or emotional crutches of which Vince had been hers. But if she'd learned anything these past few weeks, it was that she couldn't just pretend to be strong, hiding behind a wedding ring and the Patrizio name. It wasn't fair to Vince. It was time to reclaim her strength and stand on her own. That's my Christmas present to me. There were only 16 days until Christmas. But with Vince here, Christmas was coming early this year. Jill went over her rehearsed lines, the ones she'd been planning to recite when anticipating Vince's call after receiving the divorce papers. She hadn't imagined he'd show up here. But here he is, literally. Vince opened the office door, entered, and then closed the door behind him, holding ground on the welcome mat, his finely chiseled features almost softened by the gold beribboned wreath behind him. He merely stood there, tall, stylish, and silent. His expression, proud, regal, and controlled. His lips were pressed in a flat line. His lips, unbidden, Jill thought about kisses. His kisses. The first time Vince had kissed Jill had been on their wedding day. The heartfelt feelings Vince's kiss had created inside Jill had terrified her. A recent victim of assault, she hadn't counted on wanting Vince that way. Theirs was supposed to be a marriage of convenience, a sham between friends to protect her baby from her attacker's parents. She'd left Las Vegas and her maternal grandparents and returned to Harmony Valley in this place. At first, she'd expected Vince to show up. For Christmas, for New Year's Eve, for Teddy's birth, she'd prepared a speech in her head. Something like, "I can't be your real wife, not after what happened to me, but I need to be your pretend wife, if only for a little while longer." But he'd never come charging in, never demanded his marital rights, and never asked for a divorce. Why had he never asked for a divorce? She'd been afraid to contact him and ask. Vince must have moved at the doorway, made some sound, because Jill's focus returned to him and those strong arms that had swept her close a few weeks ago after Brian's funeral. It was then that Vince had told Jill he wanted to reconcile. Then that he'd kissed her a second time, again creating a conflicted response. Again she'd panicked and left Las Vegas. But this time she'd done the adult thing, drawn up divorce papers, and finally he'd come after her. Because he wanted to stay in an unconsummated marriage? That made no sense. Neither did the way Vince stared at Jill, facial features having eased into mixture of longing and regret, as if our marriage had been real. How could that be? "I let this pretend marriage go on for too long," Jill began, resorting to the openings she'd rehearsed ever since she'd called a divorce lawyer a few weeks back. I'm sorry, too." Tone conciliatory, Vince strode forward with that hitch to his step, a quirk that made him seem less perfect to strangers but not to her. "I gave you space that I thought you needed. And then, life got in the way." Vince rested his elbows on the check-in counter, clasped his hands, and stared into Jill's eyes, as if he wants to kiss me again. Jill's mouth went dry, and then went drier when she noticed that Vince still wore a plain gold band on his left hand. Had he worn that wedding ring the day of Brian's funeral? She couldn't remember. I should have removed my wedding ring. It sent the wrong signal. But something had kept Jill from doing so, even after she'd signed the divorce papers and sent them off to him. She regretted that now, if only because Vince didn't seem amenable to divorce. "I told myself I'd divorce you when I turned 20, Jill returned to her script. "And then 25, but 30. It's time, don't you think? Vince shook his head slowly. I married you because you wanted to protect me, Jill finished for him. You never asked questions, and I appreciated that because our marriage held the Salazars off until Brian's death. But now? I learned this week that his grieving parents are demanding a DNA test, Vince said in an emotionless voice that nonetheless inspired emotion in Jill, fear. This isn't the time to get a divorce, Jill. Outside the office window, Teddy was being chased by Maddie around the 6-foot-tall live fir tree in the yard. Her son's expression was innocently gleeful. Jill wanted to protect that innocence. She planned to take the truth of his conception to her grave. Vince shifted and sighed as if standing bothered his injured leg. The Salazars had 2 boys, both dead now. They're desperate for a connection to Brian. And because you didn't report what Brian did years ago, Jill, his parents have an avenue to pursue in terms of visitation. Jill felt chilled, trapped, victimized once more. My lawyers feel we need to present a united front and live together. Vince reached across the counter and took Jill's hand, her left hand. His thumb brushed over the small diamond ring he'd given her all those years ago. We need to stand behind the argument that it isn't in Teddy's best interest to reveal how he was conceived, or to subject him to visits with the parents of a criminal who— This isn't a rash decision, Jill gasped out. She'd spent too many hours staring at the ceiling after talking to a lawyer, considering strategies and weighing it against what was right. Jill gently withdrew her hand from his. A divorce adds to the legitimacy of my defense that it isn't in Teddy's best interest to introduce something new during this time of upheaval. I consulted with my own attorney. Granted, her lawyer wasn't as high profile as Vince's, but the laws they were using for her defense were the same. Vince looked disapproving. Oh, he didn't frown. His mouth remained in a straight line, but his brows lowered, ever so slightly. We're not getting divorced, Vince said in that steadfast, even tone of command he'd used with her a few weeks ago when he talked of Reckon's hand over hers. Don't you want to be free of me? Jill's words sounded meek and indecisive. She pushed on anyway. Don't you want to pursue other women? No. Vince's black gaze bore into hers, so determined, so passionate. Because I love you. The earth shook. You love me? Jill stared at their hands, those wedding rings, trying to process his proclamation of love to see if it changed anything when it came to her decision to end their marriage. It didn't. If anything, it made her that much more resolute to see this through. You're doubting my feelings, Vince said, an edge sharpening his tone. No. Jill tried to appear as committed to her decision as he was to challenging it. If only he wasn't saying things she'd only dared dream of. I'm trying to be honest with myself and with you. I can't be your wife, Vince, not in the truest sense of the word. Chapter 2. I love you, Vince repeated baldly, at a loss for what else to say to Jill. I always have. She appeared no less shocked than the first time he'd declared his feelings. Brown eyes wide and on the swivel, lips forming a delicate O, her hands ebbing and flowing through the air as if attached by strings to the rapid rise and fall of her chest. She's panicking. At any moment, he expected her to run. And his leg was so stiff from the drive that Vince doubted he could catch her if she did. But then Jill's hands came to rest on the pink countertop, and her gaze came to rest on him. That can't be true. You must be in love with the idea of me, the way I've been in love with the idea of you. The long drive here, his lack of sleep, the stakes of their marriage to Teddy's emotional well-being and Vince's heart, her rejection, all that tension. It was weaving a tight web across his back, up his shoulders and through his neck, stiffening his stance. But even though his body felt tight enough to shatter, his mind was working overtime. Replaying Jill's words. The worst of her words. I can't be your wife, not in the truest sense of the word. You must be in love with the idea of me, the way I've been in love with the idea of you. And then his mind ground to a halt, and everything inside of him tried to squeeze through the opening she'd given him, trying to reach a place where she could love him in return. He took in Jill's pretty face. You're in love with the idea of me. Not a question, but a statement of fact. If that was true, How long would it take to move Jill from the concept of loving Vince to the reality of being in love with him? Yes, maybe. Jill's hands were moving once more, tugging at the neckline of her black sweatshirt, grasping the ties that bunched the hood. But her eyes seemed fixed on something behind him. The Christmas tree? Teddy? Even if I'm in love with the idea of you, I still can't be your wife. Not in the truest sense of the word, Vince murmured, repeating her words, understanding dawning. Because of what happened with Brian? She nodded, taking a step back from the counter, cheeks draining of color. It's not fair to you. How do you know? A demoralizing thought struck home deep in his chest. Have you dated other men? Tried to? No, we're married. Jill's chin shot up. Relief rushed through him, dissolving some strands of tension, giving him hope. I've been faithful, too. But the question remained. How do you know? It was a question he couldn't finish, a topic he didn't feel he had the right to broach. Color not only returned to Jill's cheeks, it blossomed a bright holly red. It's your kiss, she whispered. It disgusts you? Vince couldn't ask for fear it was the truth. I'm going to have to sign those divorce papers. Your kiss, Jill began, wetting her lips and sneaking a glance at his. It makes me want to not stop kissing you, but I just don't know how far. They stared at each other in silence. Laughter drifted to them from outside, where presumably more Christmas decorating was being done. The first few guitar notes from Jingle Bell Rock drifted into the office, so playful, so cheery. Vince had no laughter, no holiday spirit, because you're afraid of being with anyone. Even me. Jill nodded. But we haven't tried. This conversation was filled with pitfalls, and Vince had a bad record with pitfalls, being prone to fall in holes headfirst. Jill's gaze drifted away once more. He followed its path this time. She was staring at a family photo, framed and hanging near the front window. A smiling couple stood in front of a Christmas tree and behind a beaming young girl holding a golden squirming puppy. They all wore hideous Christmas sweaters. The girl was Jill. He could tell by the curve of her smile. She wants a family like that, like hers growing up. Hope, that fickle thread, twisted and tangled around Vince's heart, determined not to let go. She wants to make a marriage work. It was the opening he'd been waiting over 11 years for. Mom! Teddy burst into the office and came to stand next to Vince. He brought with him the smell of fir needles, the outdoors, and boy sweat. I just had the best idea. Dad can stay with me in my room. He beamed up at Vince, wanting a family unit just as much as his mother seemed to, only the kid was more willing to show it. I have a bunk bed. What a nice offer. Vince laid his arm loosely across Teddy's shoulders, giving him a side hug, all the while smiling reassuringly at Jill, who looked torn. He wanted to hug her too and assure her he was willing to take their relationship at any pace she needed. Teddy, am I the top or bottom bunk? Bottom? Teddy grabbed Vince's hand and tugged him around the counter. Come on, Dad, I'll show you. Vince let himself be led through a door and into the main house, as if he was indeed Teddy's father. It was a facet of his identity that Vince hadn't fully incorporated into himself, but Teddy made him want to succeed at it. He very nearly bumped into another Christmas tree in the foyer, this one decorated with race cars and action figures. A brown sofa just large enough for two sat across from a dated video game system on a shelf beneath a small TV. 3 ladder-back chairs hemmed in a rectangular wooden table shoved against a wall. The kitchen was severely dated, plain oak cabinetry, pink formica counters. Every window had thick black privacy curtains, a stark contrast to the explosion of Christmas. A garland strung across each curtain rod, a small Christmas village displayed a narrow buffet, a ceramic Santa sitting in the middle of the dining table, a red and green dish towel hanging over the edge of the sink, Frosty the Snowman salt and pepper shakers on the stove. Jill loves Christmas. He'd forgotten that, perhaps because at the Bella Vista Christmas was a logistical operation, not an expression of authentic holiday spirit. What else had he forgotten about her? This is my room. Teddy waved Vince through a door, then began picking up the mess. 2 pairs of soccer cleats, more than a day's worth of dirty clothes, and a black backpack open to reveal a worn math book. Do you like soccer? I do, and video games. While the preteen rambled on about his favorite things, Vince took inventory of Teddy's room. The bunk beds were wooden and looked like a DIY project. The bedspreads reflected the Christmas tree decorations in the living room. Action heroes covered the bottom bunk, Formula One race cars the top. There were trophies for soccer lining a windowsill, and the entire series of Percy Jackson books on a shelf above a small wooden desk. A faded picture of teenage Jill sitting on a rock in the woods next to an ancient yellow Labrador was pinned to the bookshelf. "Do you have a dog?" Vince took a closer look at Jill's photo. She seemed happy, her smile unburdened. Vince wanted her to look that way more often. "Mom says a dog wouldn't be good for guests. You know, barking and stuff." Teddy sniffed a navy blue polo shirt, then hung it up in his closet. "I ask for a puppy every Christmas." And then he turned big, puppy dog eyes Vince's way. Christmas is coming. Immediately, Vince felt a stronger affinity for the boy because he wasn't letting an opportunity to fulfill a dream pass him by. But the fact remained, "I'm not going to break your mother's rules for you." He was betting on the long game, not just one hand. "But you're not opposed to dogs," Teddy said carefully. "Correct." He'd just never had one himself. He'd gone from living in a penthouse in a casino to living in a college dorm to living in military barracks to living on his own. "What's your feeling about fish?" Teddy grabbed hold of a bedpost and then leaned his body away from the bed. He was either fidgety or nervous. Vince's money was on nerves. "Fish as in the ones that swim in a tank? Fish you eat." Teddy scrunched his nose. "Are you going to make me eat fish? Not if you don't want to." But the question gave rise to another. What kind of dad do I want to be? Anything other than my own. Teddy's nose unscrunched. "Do you have a cookie jar in your kitchen?" "No, but I live alone, so if I want a cookie, I just buy a big one for myself." Vince noticed a stack of board games and jigsaw puzzles on the closet shelf. The box edges were worn, as if they'd been well used. "I have a candy drawer in my office." "Chocolate bars?" Teddy guessed, a secretive smile forming on his face. "Peanut butter cups." There was nothing like chocolate and peanut butter to lift Vince's spirits when he was down, a condition that had occurred more often this past year as his grandfather became more volatile at work. Moving to the window, Vince picked up one of Teddy's trophies. It was for most valuable player. "You must have some talent at soccer." "I like scoring goals." Teddy came to stand next to him, nothing if not dogged in his interest in Vince, since he seemed to be gauging his every reaction. "Do you think kids should have time limits on weekend video game playing?" Vince set the trophy back in its place. "This is beginning to sound like a job interview. I've waited a long time to meet you, and I haven't begun to scratch the surface of my questions." Teddy was serious. And Vince supposed he had a right to be. "How am I doing so far? Passing grade, I think, but it's early days yet." Teddy shrugged, trying to look nonchalant. He picked up the trophy Vince had just put down. "I just tried out for a soccer travel team. I get to practice with them, but I'm on probation. I have to obey the rules and get along with everybody." "In addition to being a good soccer player," Vince guessed. "Which means that I'm under probation as your dad." Teddy nodded. "Makes sense." Sam joined them, leaning his tall, lanky frame against the door jamb. "You'll want to win over Glamma. She's Annie and Jill's grandmother." Teddy scoffed, putting the trophy back on the windowsill. "Glamma's the least of his worries." "Really?" Vince made a gimme motion with his hand. "Don't hold back, Teddy. Who else do I need to win over?" "Mom's best friends, which include her cousin Annie." Teddy began ticking off the friend list. Mina, Corey, and their kids, of course, Maddie, Liam, and Michael, were tight. "Yep," Sam nodded, and not with any hint of superiority, as if he was still on this same journey for his fiancée's sake. "Let me get this straight." Vince tried to put everything in perspective as he faced Teddy. "I've got to win over you, your mother, 3 of her friends, 3 of their kids, and 1 grandmother?" Teddy nodded solemnly. "Piece of cake." Vince tried to make light of it. Sam scoffed. "Come on, Prince Charming. I need help putting up the last few strings of lights outside." From the office window, Jill and Annie watched Vince and Sam string Christmas lights around the hot tub gazebo. Teddy was pulling Maddie around the retreat grounds on a wagon. It was all so domestic. For Jill, having Vince here was surreal. She felt fragile inside, like her great-grandmother's Christmas star atop the tree next to her. Surface crackled and points cracking. unable to withstand anything too upsetting. But she felt excited too. Vince loves me. Jill glanced at the Christmas photo with her parents the year they'd gotten her a puppy. Does he love me enough to stay here? She didn't know. Vince is helpful, Annie said from the other side of the Christmas tree. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was visible through the branches. And not just as your chess move against the Salazars. Are you sure you want to divorce him? He said he loved me, Jill blurted without meaning to. He loves you? Annie lifted a few branches, then stared at Jill through the gap in swaying train ornaments. I always wondered why he didn't divorce you. I wondered that too. But love? We were friends for less than 9 months in high school. The year she'd been sent away while her parents patched up their marriage. Vince can't love me. I don't think love operates on a timeline. Annie let the branches fall back in place, no help at all. I fell in love with Sam in less than 2 weeks. During which time the chemistry between you was hot, even if you were at odds. But Vince, all I got from him were friend vibes in high school. Outside, Vince stretched to his full height to hook the strand of lights. No dad bod on him. Jill cleared her throat. Vince was the guy who made sure I had a sharp pencil for tests. He'd ask me if I read all the homework pages and brief me on the contents if I hadn't. Just your average lab partner, Annie quipped with obvious sarcasm. I've got news for you. Those are secret crush signals. How many teenage boys do you remember from high school who watched out for you? None, Jill squirmed. You liked Vince enough to ask him to marry you, Annie pointed out. Deep down, you must have had feelings for him too. I can't remember. That year was something of a blur. Whether or not Vince loves me, the fact remains he's not signing the divorce papers. Do you listen to yourself? Annie came around the Christmas tree and gave Jill a side hug. If Vince loves you and you love him, don't start. Jill dragged her gaze away from Vince. Stick to reality. His grandfather owns a very large luxury casino. As the only grandchild, Vince is going to inherit it someday. In the meantime, I can't see him living here and helping me plunge toilets and set mousetraps, waiting for that day to come. Just look at him. He'd shown up in dress slacks. There was probably a matching suit jacket in his highly impractical red sports car. I can picture you living in Las Vegas. You clean up pretty well. Annie tugged her phone from her hoodie pocket, tapped the screen, and then flashed a picture of Jill in a little black dress and heels. You're a babe. That was me dressed up for a funeral, and to go to battle with the Salazars. Jill gently pushed Annie's phone away. You know that's not me. Whose side are you on? Love and happiness. Annie hugged Jill once more, always on the side of love and happiness. You need a plan, Sam told Vince, climbing a ladder at the corner of the hot tub gazebo. Right. Vince slowly undid a tangle in the last 6 feet of lights, glad that someone other than Teddy was on his side. An 11-year-old could only help so much. I've got to win over a lot of people. Elvis was singing Blue Christmas from whatever speaker Jill had installed in the yard. Not exactly a good omen. Vince hadn't thought this through. He'd just reacted, arriving without a suitcase. And it wasn't as if Harmony Valley had a department store. Solidifying a relationship with Teddy is a priority, Sam went on. Vince's friend was good at strategic problem-solving, using his skills to help track down teenage runaways. Obviously, you need someone on your side in the house, and Teddy's a good kid. Spend time with him the way a loving dad would. A loving dad. Vince didn't know much about that. That's what I do with Maddie, Sam said humbly. Now that I'm over the worst of my PTSD, we schedule dates, just the two of us. I take her to the park or for a taco. When Annie and I get married, I want Maddie to know how important she is to me. That's good advice. Vince held up an empty socket in the light strand. Do we have extra bulbs? This one's missing. In the bottom of the blue bin over there. Directions made, Sam continued with his take on Vince's love life. Jill and Annie's friendship circle is tight, but they'll support you if they see you make Jill happy. I'll let you know when they have their wine Sundays. Right, I'm all for wine Sundays. He enjoyed wine. Vince dug around in the plastic bin until he found a small package of replacement bulbs. And don't you worry, I can be charming. He inserted the bulb in the empty socket, then handed Sam the last section of lights. Do not be corporate charming. Sam extended his long arms and hooked the strand along the last few hooks, and then he fixed Vince with a stern stare. Winning over friends and family is about letting your guard down and being your authentic self. And that's exactly how you're going to get Jill fall in love with you. The real you. Vince nodded. Is there a flower shop in town? He could order Jill poinsettias or perhaps gift her a live Christmas tree from a local nursery. Is there a romantic restaurant nearby? I could take Jill on a nice date. Somewhere they could talk and not be interrupted. Jill's a working mom, Vince. Sam climbed down the ladder. A blue jeans and tennis shoe wearing soccer mom. Not only does she not have time for a fancy date, but she probably doesn't have the energy to get dressed up for one. She practically runs this place by herself, 24/7. I get it. Vince plugged in the lights, which all seemed to come on, thank goodness. In the fading afternoon light, their glow was welcoming. Jill would rather have the house clean, the dinner made, and a foot rub than be treated to dinner at a high-end restaurant. That's a start. Sam collapsed the ladder and carried it downhill toward a good-sized storage shed which was nearly packed to overflowing. The shed was tucked to the side of the house where Jill and Teddy lived. The house was on one side of the parking lot, and the two-story motel-style building was on the other, set further up the hill. The buildings were surrounded by pines on three sides, allowing views of the granite summit of the mountain along the south. Vince picked up the plastic tub with the remaining lights and followed Sam. Laughter behind him had Vince turning at the shed door. At the top of the incline on the far side of the hot tub, Teddy and Maddie climbed into a red wagon. As soon as Teddy lifted his feet from the ground, the wagon rolled forward, picking up speed. They barreled past Vince, whooping gleefully. And then they crashed into the storage shed. Their whoops stopped. Their wagon tipped over, they spilled out, and the giggling began. Vince passed the blue tub to Sam, then helped the kids to their feet. Are you supposed to do that? No, but we like it. Teddy righted the wagon, a classic red flyer with a colorful past, if the dents and scratches on it were any indication. Now, Mom, she likes Christmas. And for Glamma to clean toilets, Maddie said sagely, dusting off her jeans. Glamma makes the beds here, but she always forgets the toilets. And when that happens, sometimes I have to clean toilets. Teddy stowed the wagon upright in the shed, pushing to make it fit. A car full of people pulled into the parking lot. That's our cue to leave. Sam closed the storage shed door. Come on, Maddie, tomorrow's Monday. Go tell your mom it's time to leave. Glamma is probably wondering where you are on a school night. Okay, Sammy. Maddie skipped next to him. She pointed toward the parking lot. Look, the shiny red car has a flat tire. The shiny red car? My red car? That would be a yes. The right front tire had gone completely flat. Vince tried to tell himself that was a mixed blessing. Jill couldn't turn him away if he was stranded. Come on, Dad. For the second time that day, Teddy took Vince's hand and dragged him along. He stopped near his bedroom window and turned off a speaker, cutting Elvis off mid-blue. Mom doesn't like noise while guests check in. She says we have to be spa-like. Vince glanced around. There was nothing plush or spa-like that he could see. The two-story guest lodging had a redwood-colored stucco finish. The parking lot was paved in gravel. And the hot tub, even though steam rose from it, the decking steps looked slippery and mildewy. He must have been dragging his feet because Teddy gave his hand a mighty tug. Just follow my lead and you'll be fine. And for those few moments that Teddy held his hand, Vince believed it. Chapter 3. Gloria Ray, a.k.a. Glamma, was certain that she'd forgotten something. She stood with the refrigerator door open, staring at its contents and talking to herself. It wasn't dinner. I already had dinner. She'd just finished a bowl of vegetable soup from the slow cooker. And I'm not going to the grocery store. Because it was dark outside, she always shopped in the early morning before heading up for a shift at the railroad stop retreat. The refrigerator hummed in a higher gear, possibly not happy that she was letting all the cold air out. Demoralized, Glamma closed the door. And there it was. The reason she'd come to the refrigerator was written on a note on the door, change TV remote batteries. Glamma opened the refrigerator door once more and took out 2 small batteries from the cubby where she stored eggs. I swear I'd forget where my head was if I didn't write it down. And she would have laughed at that if it wasn't true. Glamma was very much aware that she wasn't as sharp as she used to be. Dementia ran in her family on her mother's side, and it was no laughing matter. She took the batteries to the living room, sat down, and picked up the remote. Now, where do these batteries go? She pressed buttons and pushed panels, all to no avail. The clock on the mantel chimed 6. Glamma stared at the clock and the 2 framed pictures that flanked it. She recognized herself in those pictures, both featuring her in her prime. Sparkly, skimpy, Vegas showgirl costumes, and 3-foot-tall feather headdresses. How can I remember that's me and not remember what the 6 o'clock hour signifies? Those chimes, they taunted her. I do something at 6. Glamma stared around the room, annoyed with herself for not remembering. Annoyance was better than self-pity any day. She stared at the items in her lap, wondering about the remote and batteries because batteries were for... Argh! She couldn't remember. The front door opened. Hey, Glamma. Annie entered the house with Maddie. They were both fresh-cheeked, and their blonde hair looked wind-blown. Why aren't you watching the news? You always watch the news at 6. I do, Glamma said, a sense of normalcy and awareness returning. Were you changing the remote batteries? Annie set down her purse on the entry table. I forgot to do it this morning. Here, let me do it. Glamma sat back in her chair, allowing her grown granddaughter to change the batteries and turn on the TV. As if I'm disabled, which she kind of was, but didn't want to be. You look like you need a hug, Glamma. Little Maddie climbed into her lap and gave her one, leaning her head on Glamma's shoulder and counting the pearls in her necklace. Such a good hug, my girl. But that hug wasn't enough to chase away the fear that change was coming, and the worst of it was, Glamma wasn't certain she'd recognize change when it arrived. Chapter 4. Jill spent the 90 minutes after Annie, Sam, and Maddie left smiling cordially, checking in members of a sewing circle from Santa Rosa, receiving the pizza and salad delivery from town for the group's dinner, and wondering what Vince and Teddy were up to in the house. Finally, having set up the casual buffet and drink station, checked on her guests and ensuring that all the outside holiday lights were on timers that would go dark at 10, Jill locked up the office and entered her home. Vince and Teddy sat on the sofa playing a video game. This is what you've been doing this whole time? Jill tried to hold on to her patience, but she was tired and had neglected to hold back a pizza for their own dinner. And then she noticed that something smelled wonderful and the dining table was set. We made dinner, Mom. Wonder of wonders, Teddy paused the game and got to his feet. I boiled noodles, and I made a sauce from what I could find in the kitchen. Vince gestured toward the table. Sit down and I'll bring it out. Teddy gently guided Jill toward her seat. You must be tired after a long day. Who are you and what have you done with my child? Jill joked, feeling something inside of her loosen. Is this what it's like to tag team parent? Once she was seated, Teddy brought her a glass of water and sat next to her. How was your day? Jill gave him her patented mom stare. Did you break something? Is that why you've gone to all this fuss? Ouch, Mom. You wound me. But Teddy's look of faux innocence wasn't fooling Jill. Is she always this suspicious? Vince set a plate in front of Jill, and then Teddy. Only when I try to be extra good, Teddy admitted, with one of his future heartbreaker grins. Like when I ask for a puppy, or when you forget to do your homework, Jill murmured. Teddy pulled a face and repeated, I'm being extra good because I love you, and my homework is all done. Gold Star Day, is it? But Jill wasn't up to the teasing game. She stared at her plate, mouth-watering. Pasta was covered in a red sauce with mushrooms. It smelled of garlic. A breaded chicken patty sat on top, sprinkled with melting Parmesan cheese. Jill waited until Vince had sat down with a plate before diving in. This is delicious. Where did you learn to make this sauce? And how had she not realized she had these ingredients in her kitchen? Funny thing about my grandfather. Vince cut up his chicken patty with the dining etiquette of a prince. He believes you can't run a large operation until you've worked in all the jobs that make it a success. I spent 3 months working as a sous chef in the kitchens of the Bella Vista. Jill added, skilled chef, to the mental tally she was keeping of all the reasons Vince couldn't live here. You knew this recipe by heart? No, I just threw in what I found that I thought would work well together, Vince said simply, not boastful in the least. Jill added, humble, to his list of likable attributes, although she supposed she already knew that. It's so good. Teddy, who'd been critical of Jill's kitchen performance lately, gushed, Can you teach Mom how to make this? And before Jill could gape at her son, Vince came back with, No, I'll teach you, and that way you won't have to eat frozen fish. Deal, Teddy beamed at Vince, his new favorite person, the man he thinks is his biological father. Is Teddy asleep? Vince asked Jill after she closed Teddy's bedroom door. He was in the kitchen with a surprise for her. Jill nodded, moving toward him. She'd spent the past 20 minutes checking on her guests, locking up, and tucking Teddy in bed. And now, she looked at Vince sternly, as if she'd prepared a speech to tell him to leave tomorrow, flat tire or not. His only hope was to keep her off balance. I made dessert. Vince moved to meet Jill halfway, presenting her with a spoon and a coffee mug that contained blueberries, vanilla yogurt, and crumbled graham crackers. Then he sat on the sofa and patted the cushion next to him. Oh, Teddy will never forgive you for making me dessert, and not him. After a moment's hesitation, Jill perched on the sofa as if determined not to linger. Disheartening, that. I have a long way to go. He'd turned down the lights and closed her privacy curtains while she'd been gone. They sat in the glow of the Christmas tree, almost like a married couple. Almost. Vince swirled his spoon through his parfait, wondering, not for the first time, how he was going to navigate the road to winning Jill's love. Can I tell you a secret? At her nod, he admitted, Teddy ate his dessert before dinner. That's such a cliché for a dad to do. Jill gave him a half smile. Heartened, Vince smiled back at her. I'm new at this. Give me some grace. Do you do laundry? Give foot rubs? Jill's smile evened out, matching the sparkle in her rich brown eyes. You seem too good to be true. Did my fairy godmother send you? If that's what you wished for, then yes. He'd give her the moon if that's what made her smile at him like that. He gestured toward the tree by the door, the one decorated with race cars and superheroes. Tell me about your tree decorations, in here and in the office. Jill seemed to relax a bit, leaning into the arm of the sofa and taking a spoonful of his parfait. This is Teddy's tree to decorate. Last year it was all ping-pong balls. He painted them to look like soccer balls, only we couldn't figure out how to put hangers in them without deflating them, so they sat on branches. Or rather, she smiled at him, they rolled off branches. I swear they multiplied underneath this sofa over the past year. I found another one just last week. For some reason, Vince said slyly, I wouldn't put it past Teddy to be behind that. Me either. They shared a brief smile before Jill returned her gaze to the Christmas tree. And the office tree? Vince prompted, setting his empty dessert mug on the coffee table. Those are train ornaments my parents collected over the years. Jill ate another spoonful. I've considered changing that theme to gnomes, if only because they make me smile, but the tree reinforces our name. It's odd to be called Railroad Stop because the actual stop for the old railroad was down the hill in the northern Napa Valley. Legend has it that folks got off at the station and hiked up here for the view. From the summit, you can see valleys on both sides of us. I'll show you before you leave if you like. I'd like that. What he didn't like was Jill already imagining him out the door. He needed to begin his campaign to prove his love. Do you remember the first day in science lab, when Mr. Templeton was pairing kids up? And somehow we were put together. Jill gave him a wan smile. I bet you wish that went differently. We'd never have gotten married. Vince shook his head. I chose you, Jill. At her astonished look, he went on. When I saw Mr. Templeton pairing people sharing tables, I came over to sit with you. He didn't wait for her to ask why, preferring to explain. Listen, I wasn't a jock. I wasn't a nerd. I didn't sing in choir or play in the marching band, and the Patrizio name wasn't good enough for the in-crowd. Not as hip as new casino owners. Not as accepted as the original casino owner families. What was left? Being a bully? He scoffed. My father was a bully, and that was never going to be me. Being new, neither of us had a place there. Jill set her mug next to his. You had no idea who I was. You accepted me at face value, the same way I did you. That's not a reason to fall in love, Jill said gently. But it's a reason to base a friendship on, Vince said just as gently. Sometimes the deepest love grows from a solid friendship. And yet, when I left, you didn't call or text me. Her gaze challenged, or perhaps accused. Vince ran a hand around the back of his neck. I didn't think you wanted to hear from me, and there were things he wanted to tell her about the years they'd been apart and how he'd yearned to contact her, but he sensed now wasn't the time. You've done a great job raising Teddy. He's a good kid, he said instead. Thank you. Jill got to her feet, gathering the empty mugs briskly, as if she'd expected to hear more and was disappointed. Thanks for dinner. I'll do the dishes. They're already done. Vince got to his feet. Your fairy godmother was very adamant that I anticipate and fulfill your every wish. Jill entered the kitchen, steps slowing. I'm too busy and tired to wish for much. I'm here to change all that. Vince bid her good night, sparing a glance to the whimsically decorated Christmas tree if only to wish upon its star, for Jill to love him back. Dad, time to wake up. What? Vince sat bolt upright and knocked his head on a bottom slat of the top bunk of Teddy's bedroom. Ow! Vince swung his legs around and got to his feet without more head thunks. What time is it? Time to leave for school. It's missed the bus day. Teddy sat on the floor, lacing up his tennis shoes. When you didn't wake up with my alarm, I moved slow enough to miss the school bus. Now Mom's gonna drive me. Without me, I get it. Vince pulled on his slacks and tugged on his white dress shirt over his t-shirt. I'll be right there. He darted out of the bedroom and into the bathroom, which was steamy from someone's morning shower. There was a toothbrush in a new package on the bathroom counter. A present from Jill, he presumed. A few minutes later, Vince was back in Teddy's bedroom gathering his shoes and socks. He took out his phone, tapped an app, and said, Add clothes shopping to today's agenda. Okay, added after you fix your tire. Are you on the phone? Teddy glanced around. Who's talking? My virtual assistant. That's cool. Mom's warming up the car. Here. Teddy handed Vince a black railroad stop retreat hoodie. I took this from the storage closet. It's cold outside. Now, when we get into town, I'll stay in the car while Mom places my hot chocolate order at Martin's. I think you should go in with her. Right, to pay. Teddy rolled his eyes. Sure, whatever. And then he stomped out the door, muttering to himself about rookie dads. Tugging the hoodie over his head, Vince followed him. Outside, the air was bright and crisp, not a cloud in the sky, unless you counted the clouds made by Vince's breath. Teddy, I told you not to wake him, Jill chiding when Vince buckled into the front passenger seat. She was wearing a red and white striped Christmas sweater and a holly-trimmed headband in her hair. It was his idea to come, Mom. Teddy buckled into the seat behind Jill. You always say we have to be nice to guests. Vince bit back a smile. This kid, I could hug him. They needed to move past the fist-bumping stage of their relationship. Jill drove slowly up to the summit and then down the mountain switchbacks that led to Harmony Valley. She waved at a woman riding her bike up the steep road going the other way. What is she doing? Vince glanced over his shoulder at the cyclist's disbelief. Training for an Ironman or something? Jill slowed for the next hairpin turn. Emma rides her bike up here every morning. At least, she knows how to ride a bike, Teddy grumbled. We live on top of a mountain, Jill said in a tone that implied this wasn't the first time they'd had this argument. The only place to ride is downhill. I can't get past the vision of you wiping out into a tree or pressing the front brake instead of the back and flipping over onto your head. She's got a point, Vince allowed, taking out his phone and typing bicycle into his list of items to shop for. It came right below Christmas decorations. All the little kids know how to ride bikes, Teddy continued to lament, pressing his nose to his window. All the little kids? Vince teased. All around the world? He means the children of my friends, Jill explained. They're all younger than he is. Maddie's age, Teddy added, as if this added insult to injury. There's a bike parade at school every spring, and every spring I watch. Vince added, give Teddy bike riding lessons, to his to-do list. He'd barely finished before his phone came alive with buzzes, beeps, and vibration. Great signal down here, His email inbox was now bulging with messages. He'd need to go through them and make business phone calls later. They reached the valley floor where pine trees gave way to eucalyptus and oak. Jill drove through a well-kept neighborhood of older homes before reaching the town square, which was a very large square patch of grass with a towering, grand oak tree in the middle. "What do you think, Teddy? Bagel and cream cheese?" Jill waved another driver ahead at a stop sign. "Chocolate donut with sprinkles, Mom." Teddy sounded as if he was still smarting about not being a bicyclist. "A bagel and cream cheese will fill you up," Jill countered. "I bet they'll have cinnamon raisin. More likely raisin and horseradish." Teddy heaved a sigh that was so loud it covered Vince's sharp intake of breath at the mention of horseradish. "Chocolate donut with sprinkles, please. I'll eat extra vegetables tonight." At 11, Teddy was quite the negotiator. Although he'd had nothing to do with it, Vince took pride in that skill. Fatherhood was turning out to be as perplexing as love. "All right." Jill pulled into a parking space in front of a brick-fronted building with a large picture window and a few small wrought iron tables in front. "But I won't forget you promised to eat extra veggies tonight." "Glamma would," Teddy said in a voice barely above a whisper. Vince got out of the SUV with Jill, an action that only earned him a sigh as weary as Teddy's at the mention of raisin and horseradish bagels. "What?" he asked. "Nothing." She slung a purse over her shoulder. Oh, it was something, but not something he was going to fix in the next 5 minutes. Vince glanced around, but the first thing he noticed was the temperature. "It's warmer here." Not near as nippy as it had been at the retreat. "It's usually 10 degrees warmer here in the valley." Jill moved toward the sidewalk. "It's still not cold enough to snow up where we are. I wouldn't mind snow at Christmas." Vince stretched his legs to reach the bakery's door first to open it for her. Martin's Bakery had a collection of mismatched tables and chairs, most of which were full. Oddly enough, the majority of customers were gray-haired. No laptops sat on tables, no one had on noise-canceling headphones on or their nose pointed at a device, and holiday sweaters, they seemed to be a prerequisite. The customer base was unlike that of any other coffee shop Vince had ever been in. Mellow Christmas music played softly, perhaps to allow the elderly customers to hear each other better. Vince continued to look around. Christmas decorations abounded, including a large live tree in the back. The brick side wall was devoted to very old photos of people kneading dough, taking bread out of the oven, and selling pies at the bakery case. A bench had been built beneath the front window where an elderly woman with purplish-gray hair and a green elf sweater played with 2 toddler boys. A baby bassinet sat near her, containing a slumbering baby with a pink knit cap. Talk stopped upon their entry. Jill gave a brisk wave on her way to the bakery case. "Don't mind him. That's my husband." A wave of curiosity washed over Vince in the form of 8 to 10 elderly people rising up out of their chairs and rushing over to meet him. "We thought you didn't exist," said a pixie-sized woman who reached Vince first and gave him a side hug. Her sweater had blinking lollipops. "I'm very real," Vince assured her. "I thought you were a merchant marine busy sailing around the world." A very slender woman with white hair in a severe bun grabbed hold of his hands and spun him in a circle. Her holiday sweater featured a sparkly sugar plum fairy. "Show me your tattoos and I'll show you where you've been." "No tattoos, just a gunshot wound." Jill's gaze swung around, landed on Vince's face, and then dropped to his leg, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Cop, military, or spy?" An elderly hippie accosted Vince next. No ugly Christmas sweater for him, but he did wear a Santa hat with his purple and white tie-dyed hoodie. "Those pants? High quality. Are you James Bond? You being a spy under deep cover would explain your lengthy absence." "Nope. Marines, wounded in action." A woman with a strong resemblance to Mrs. Claus wheeled her red walker into Vince's knees. She wore a red sweatshirt with an appliqué stocking. "Oops." She backed up a few inches, staring at him from behind thick, round glasses. "Thank you for your service. What kind of car do you drive?" "Ferrari, currently with a flat tire." "You'll be needing Joe," said an old man sitting at a checkerboard. He wore a green holiday sweater with reindeer dancing across it. "I'll give him a call. He has a tow truck and a garage in town. Married my granddaughter." His hands shook noticeably as he raised his phone in front of his face and squinted at the screen. "Thank you. That helped with his to-do list. How long are you staying?" This came from a mountain of a man with a bushy white blonde beard and shoulder-length hair to match. He sat at a table along the back wall and did not participate in the holiday sweater wearing. "I've got the property nearest yours. Don't take kindly to trespassers." "Noted," Vince said over the chorus of laughter and ribbing the old man received. "You should try the horseradish biscuits," said the elderly woman with the purple hair in charge of the toddler boys and sleeping infant. "It's a local recipe." "Along with raisin and horseradish bagels, I hear." Vince smiled, trying to joke. "We're out of those today," called the brunette woman behind the bakery case. She wore a Santa cap and a red Christmas apron. "It's popular, but an acquired taste." Jill gestured for Vince to come over and get his coffee. She'd already paid, so much for looking like the breadwinner in the family. "Well, how'd it go?" Teddy asked Vince when they'd returned to Jill's car. "They pounced on him like a cat on a baby field mouse," Jill chuckled. But Vince got the last laugh, because she introduced me as her husband. Sweet. And then they didn't hear anything else out of Teddy on the short drive to school because he was devouring his donut. Chapter 5. "I've got to check on my guests," Jill told Vince after they'd returned from dropping Teddy off at school. She closed her SUV door, not expecting much conversation since they hadn't talked much on the drive back. "I laid out breakfast before we left. Glamma should be here soon to clean rooms." "I can help with the rooms," Vince offered. "I spent a month working in housekeeping. Training, remember? Patrizios don't clean guest rooms." Jill blurted, shocked that he'd offer. Although they didn't cook for wives with divorce on their mind either, but Vince had and she'd enjoyed a bit of pampering. Didn't mean Jill believed he loved her, although her traitorous heart wanted to. "Everybody cleans, Jill," Vince said, closing his door and coming around to, "Kiss me?" Jill's heart thudded in her chest as Vince approached her. "I should say something. I should do something." But blood rushed in Jill's ears. As loud as a freight train or a tow truck rumbled up the drive. Jill's arm shot out, her finger pointed at the tow truck. "That's you, I've got to run." And although she didn't run toward the 2-story retreat building, she didn't walk leisurely. "I'll come around to help you when I've got my tire trouble settled," Vince promised. "No need." Jill flung open the door to the dining hall, breathing hard. "Thin mountain air?" she told a woman pouring herself a glass of water at the beverage station. The dining hall doubled as a meeting room for guests. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided unobstructed views of the mountain summit. 2 long tables held breakfast buffet items, plates, and cutlery. The table at the corner was reserved for the beverage station. A cistern with ice water, a large coffee urn, a large hot water dispenser, and a selection of teas, creamers, and sweeteners. About 20 women of various ages occupied the main dining room. Some had set up sewing machines to assemble quilt squares. Others stitched by hand. Christmas music played from a small speaker in the corner. Deck the halls. Jill checked the beverage station, thinking about Vince being wounded in the line of duty, imagining him in a hospital room in some far-off country. Alone. The way I suffered alone. Jill entered the kitchen not without a moment of pride. And she'd upgraded everything a few years ago, bringing the kitchen to what she considered affordable commercial status. The countertops were stainless steel. The cabinets had been painted white and their doors removed. There were 2 ovens, 2 dishwashers, and a refrigerator that was bigger than 2 large home units. Everything was designed for speed and efficiency. Jill went through the motions to brew more coffee, still lost in thought. She hadn't exactly been alone after she left Vegas. She'd had a baby to comfort her, a family to embrace her, a community to support her. Who had comforted Vince? I should have been there for him. But she hadn't known. No one, not even Vince, had told her. When she'd seen him at Brian's funeral and noticed his limp, she hadn't asked him about it. That made her seem callous. And she hadn't asked Annie either, even though she probably knew since Annie was Sam's fiancée. Jill assembled salads and simple sandwiches she'd served later, while concern for Vince continued to fill her chest. She put trays of cookies in the oven to bake, mentally reviewing the cadence of Vince's limp and the quiet, patient way he looked at her sometimes. Here was a man who'd suffered and carried on, like I did. Vince deserved happiness, and he wasn't going to find it with Jill. He worked in casino management. He drove a fancy sports car and was used to eating fine food. She and Teddy had eaten canned beans and hot dogs for dinner the night before Vince arrived. They were too different and lived in different worlds. I need to ignore my heart and divorce him. Glamma joined Jill in the kitchen. She wore a long, flowing blue skirt topped with a chunky oatmeal fisherman's sweater. Her blonde hair had been straightened and brushed past her shoulders delicately, highlighting the tiger eye pendant she wore around her neck. And her makeup? Flawless as usual. Her appearance put Jill's jeans and ugly Christmas sweater to shame. She hadn't even bothered with makeup, although, truth be told, she'd considered it with Vince in the house. Glamma dropped the bucket of room cleaning supplies on the floor, causing a loud clatter. There's a strange man in the parking lot with a very fancy car, and there's a rumor in town that your husband has finally made an appearance. There was no use denying it. Yes, that's him. Larger than life, both physically and the way his presence called to her heart. Still itching for a fight, Glamma nudged the cleaning bucket with her blue bedazzled sneaker. You weren't going to invite me for dinner to meet him? Invite you? Jill spared her grandmother a frown before checking tonight's dinner menu, which was posted on the wall behind the kitchen door. How could I invite you when I didn't know he was coming? Didn't know. Glamma seemed to process this information carefully, brow wrinkled. Is he going to be a regular here in Harmony Valley? Jill barely stopped an unruly yearning to say, yes. A timer on Jill's phone went off. She silenced it, hoping to silence her fairy tale-believing heart as she slipped on an oven mitt. Vince isn't going to be a regular guest. Jill opened the oven door and reached for a cookie sheet. I'm divorcing him. That's still under discussion. Vince's voice, level and uncompromising. Jill flinched and cried out, having burned her wrist on the oven rack. Immediately, Vince was at her side, moving her back, taking off the oven mitt. He used it to remove the cookies. Then he closed and shut off the oven before drawing Jill underneath a ceiling light to examine her burn. I'm fine, she reassured him. That was a lie. Her heart was pounding faster than was expected from such a mishap, and she didn't protest as he continued to hold her hand, looking into her eyes instead of at the burn. This is nothing to complain about, especially when compared to a gunshot wound. Vince's hand lowered slowly but kept hold of hers, his touch so gentle, his eyes filled with apology. She'd seen that look before, been drawn to that expression. I'm fine, she repeated. But a memory tumbled to the forefront of her mind. As teens, they'd gone to the movies one weekend, having pre-ordered opening night tickets to a popular superhero movie. Traffic had been bad and they were running late. She'd leaped out of his car and shut the door before she found her footing, catching her fingertips in the process. She'd tried not to cry, even though her fingers throbbed. But there had been tears. Vince had taken her to a local coffee shop, got her a bag of ice, and told her in no uncertain terms that he didn't care if they missed the movie. And after she'd agreed to drop it, he'd stared at her as if her injury was his fault. He'd always been too kind to her. I'll refill the beverage station to give you some privacy. Glamma moved the coffee and water receptacles to the wheeled serving tray, the ones Jill had filled but forgotten to deliver. And then you can introduce me properly to the man you've kept secret all these years. In my defense, we've met, Vince said quietly as Glamma backed through the swinging kitchen door. I introduced myself to your grandmother outside. She's not good with names. The way Jill was beginning to believe that Vince wasn't good with sharing the details of his life with her. She wanted to know all about the ups and downs he'd experienced since their wedding day, including the injury that caused his limp. But she had no right, or she wouldn't if they divorced. But for now, she'd play the wife card. How did you get shot? Vince drew Jill's wrist with the burn closer to him, as if wanting to inspect her injury once more. More likely, he was stalling, trying to filter what to tell her. I'm guilty of the same thing. Asking him to marry her without telling him all the details. Asking him to meet her at Brian's funeral without telling him why. Her reticence to share the painful parts of her life wasn't something she was proud of. Did he feel the same way? Vince continued to stare at Jill's wrist, gently circling her burn with his thumb. After you left, I was. His voice was gruff, faltering. I was angry? You were angry? At what? At who? Please, not at me. At the world. Vince shrugged, but it was a rigid gesture. My childhood was unusual, to say the least. I had everything but love, except from my grandfather. But he was always busy building the Bella Vista into something bigger, and everything I received came at a cost. He sighed heavily, raising his gaze to hers. My father was harsher than any drill sergeant. On me. On my mother. We had appearances to keep up. She turned to drink. And Vince touched his cheekbone with his free hand, and then mirrored the movement, tenderly touching her cheek. When my grandfather realized my father was poison, my parents were banished to Florida. On the payroll, of course. You never told me that, Jill whispered, immediately missing his touch when he removed his hand from her cheek. You told me. She struggled to remember that they preferred to live the high life in the Florida Keys. Vince's gaze fell to Jill's wrist. I don't think it's going to leave a lasting scar. A change of subject, so telling. His past is as painful as mine. I might be scarred inside if you don't tell me the rest of your angry story, Jill gently chided. Those black eyes returned to her face. If you really wanted a divorce, he let the statement dangle unfinished between them. If you really wanted a divorce, you wouldn't ask such personal questions. I'm not divorcing you today, Jill said, trying to muster some sass. That's how badly she wanted to hear what had made him angry. Anger wasn't an emotion she associated with Vince. Today, we're still married. Vince's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. One secret deserves another, Jill. You didn't contact me until recently. There's a reason for that, too. He wants truths from me in return. Answers to riddles she'd put off unraveling all this time, such as, why had she stayed married to Vince? Tension hummed around them. Jill couldn't help but feel this was an important moment, something that could be a turning point. But if I agree, which way will we turn? Toward each other? Or away? Deep down, Jill knew the way she wanted things to be. She wanted to be a family. But that path had always seemed impossible before. Now, with Vince here, saying he loved her, Jill swallowed thickly and managed to nod, silently agreeing to his terms. And then she gave him license to continue. You were angry at the world. Vince nodded, blowing out a breath. I thought with my father gone that I could be a kid, wear basketball shorts and flip-flops in the summer, go to concerts, play video games. He sked. My grandfather had other ideas. I wore suits. I sat in on meetings when I wasn't in school. I was made aware of my purpose in life. You were being groomed to run the Bella Vista. This much he'd told her before. Even if you wanted to save the world one plankton at a time. He used to joke about that in high school when she complimented him on his science savvy. My dream of being a marine biologist was a pipe dream. Vince admitted in a flat voice, a defeated voice. Something I only shared with you. I did what my grandfather wanted me to. I went to Wharton to study business. Resentful, she murmured. Angry, hurt. Vince nodded, gaze turned inward. I did my duty. I graduated among the top of my class. Wearing your suit, Jill tried to tease. She didn't like that he'd been denied choice over his life. The way she didn't like that choice had been taken away from hers. By then, business suits and business casual were my uniform, Vince admitted without a smile, perhaps still seeing the past. Other people could explore different areas of study in college. Not me. I had expectations. After graduation, I couldn't bring myself to return to Las Vegas without you, she thought Vince meant to say, feeling warmth fill her chest. Vince shifted his weight, mustered a sad smile. In an act of rebellion, I signed up for the Marines. Because of my degree, they wanted me to be an officer, but I wouldn't. I was still angry that I always did what I was told, that my future was predestined and I could only run from it for so long. His words tumbled out faster, as if he couldn't wait to be rid of them. Why would I accept another burden of responsibility that would test my loyalty to family? Lucky for me, the Marines took me as a private anyway. I ended up with Sam as my sergeant. We served overseas as part of U.S. Embassy security, and it was over there, during a parade, that we were attacked, mostly by women and children. I was the first man to notice that guns were being drawn." Vince wasn't smiling now, and his story, it was slowing down. "I was the first man shot at the embassy gate, and if it wasn't for Sam, well, I wouldn't be here today." Impulsively, Jill wrapped her arms around Vince's waist, burying her face in his chest because she hated imagining him lying on the ground and bleeding while more shots were fired. "I'm sorry." Jill wasn't certain what she was apologizing for, but the words felt necessary. The embrace felt necessary. What little comfort she could give felt necessary. After a moment, Vince's hand stroked the length of her hair. "And then you came home," Jill murmured, regretting that she hadn't known or been there for him, as a friend or anything. "Yes," he murmured, "to my place in the world, a place that hadn't included me." Her heart ached for Vince, ached for them both. She drew back, gazing up at the hard planes of his face. "Are you still angry at the world?" "At me." Because she must have caused him countless hours of disappointment, frustration, and, yes, even anger. "Are you?" "No, I'm just alone." The empty look in his black eyes confirmed it. "I feel that way too," Jill admitted, more times than she cared to acknowledge. Impulsively, she rose up on her toes, lips aiming for his. "What am I doing?" At the last second, Jill veered to the right, planting a noisy little smacker on the corner of Vince's mouth. Noisy was never serious, and even though his story touched her, she couldn't afford to fall in love with the real him, for too many reasons to count. Glamma entered, saving Jill from more intimate conversation and embarrassment. "Young man, what are you doing? You do know Jill's married, don't you?" She bustled over and pushed them apart. Jill had never been so grateful for her grandmother's humor. "I know she's married." Vince laughed, rubbing a hand around the back of his neck. "She's married to me. Glamma, isn't it? I'm Vince, remember? Your grandson-in-law." "Vince was just leaving," Jill said, making a shooing motion with her hand. Then she faced Glamma. "Don't you have someplace to be? Is it quitting time?" Glamma blinked. Jill couldn't tell if her grandmother was confused or joking. Recently, she'd been losing touch occasionally, which was worrisome. "Did you clean the guest rooms?" Glamma glanced at the big round clock on the wall. "It's too early for me to have finished." Jill gently smoothed Glamma's hair over her shoulder, pretending nothing was wrong, even though she expected her grandmother was in the midst of a memory blip. "Look, I know you hate cleaning toilets, but they need to be done while our guests are enjoying each other's company." She'd go with her to the doctor after the holidays. "I'll help," Vince offered before Glamma could respond. "Joe is taking my car back to the garage. I can't go anywhere. I might as well clean toilets while you make the beds and change out the towels, Glamma. What do you say?" "I like you, whatever your name is," Glamma said, regaining her characteristic bubbly personality. "Come along. I always start on the top floor." "Don't you need this?" Vince asked, holding up her bucket of supplies. "Those are for cleaning toilets. That's your responsibility." And with that, Jill's grandmother swished out the swinging door. "We'll talk later," Vince said to Jill before following Glamma out the door. "You owe me some answers." Jill had been hoping he'd forget about that. Chapter 6. "How's it going up on the mountain?" Sam asked when Vince met him for a coffee around 2 o'clock. Unlike the morning, Martin's bakery was nearly empty now. The Christmas music seemed livelier and patrons were not of the holiday sweater-wearing kind. "I noticed Jill let you drive her SUV. It's a mixed bag on the marital front." A peck on the cheek. A thank you for helping scrub bathrooms and listening to her grandmother talk about her glory days as a showgirl in Vegas. "The bad news for certain is my tire. It seemed it had more than one nail in it and needed to be replaced. It'll be days before a new tire gets all the way out here." It was a special order. If you can stand to be without your own wheels for a few days, I'd say that gives you a good reason to stay with Jill. Sam tapped his coffee mug to Vince's, as if toasting his good fortune. "I'll take whatever I can get." Vince's cell phone rang. It was his grandfather. He sent the call to voicemail. Almost immediately, Sam's cell phone rang. He turned his display toward Vince. "It's your grandfather." Vince tapped the red reject button on Sam's phone. Predictably, Vince's cell phone rang again. This time, he answered, "Sam and I will call you back later." and then he hung up on his grandfather before the old man began huffing and puffing. That bought us a 15-minute reprieve. Time enough to catch up more than they had yesterday. The brunette that had worked the counter that morning brought over a plate with several pale scones with white icing. She still wore her Santa cap, but her apron was now a staid brown. Horseradish vanilla scones, on the house. Horseradish? Vince eyed them warily. Thanks, Jessica. Laughing, Sam picked up one and took a bite. He grinned at Vince. You know how when you go to Vegas, you have to walk the strip? Well, if you come to Harmony Valley, you have to eat something Jessica makes with horseradish. The baker nodded, smiling pleasantly, as if she was used to wary reactions to horseradish as a baking ingredient. No one regrets trying them. Given Teddy's negative response to horseradish bagels this morning, Vince doubted that. But Sam and Jessica were looking at him. He couldn't back down. This feels like the first time my father made me eat oysters. That hadn't gone well, but Vince gamely selected a scone and took a bite, then sat back in his chair, taking in the flavors. Well? Jessica asked, eagerly awaiting his opinion. Do you like it? Sam asked, taking another one. Vince swallowed and reached for his coffee. It tastes like mellow horseradish, a hint of spice, a hint of pepper. A lot more flavor than his usual experience with scones. We know what it tastes like. How do you like it? Sam prodded, taking a bite of his second scone. It's not my daily cup of tea, Vince admitted, having found something positive to say. He gave Jessica a thumbs up, but it might earn its place in my pastry rotation. I'll take it. Jessica returned to the bakery case. Give it a week or two. They grow on you. Vince eyed the last scone on the plate. Are you going to eat that? Vince pushed the plate toward Sam. All yours. But something Sam said bothered Vince. It'll grow on me. You don't think Jill will leave Harmony Valley with me? Sam gave Vince a piercing look. You assumed she would? He rested his elbows on the table and leaned forward. How do you see this relationship with her playing out? Vince didn't want to answer. Because in his head, he saw Jill and Teddy being part of his life in Vegas, where he could do his duty and take care of his grandfather. Jill wouldn't have to work. Teddy could learn how to ride a bike in the flat neighborhood where Vince lived, and then his house wouldn't feel as empty as his heart. Vince's phone rang sooner than expected. He stared at the screen. Grandfather. I thought Aldo was semi-retired, Sam said carefully. That doesn't mean he's spending weeks at a time on a yacht in Italy. Vince didn't move to answer. If you must know, he's busy renovating the penthouse at the Bella Vista. For what? Sam's brow furrowed. For me. Vince's neck twinged. He wants me to move out of my house and live with him. Actually, he wants me to bring Jill and Teddy along too. The lawyers would prefer that as well. Sam's frown deepened. The Bella Vista is Aldo's dream, not yours. He's alone, Sam, and I thought. Vince bowed his head. I had it in my head that when he's gone, it'll finally be my time. Mine and Jill's. Jill's life is here. Her business. Most of her family. There was an odd note in Sam's voice, something akin to disappointment. It caused Vince to raise his head and look at his friend. It's the same predicament Annie and I faced. Annie's roots are here, and because I loved her. His deep, low voice ground to a halt before he pressed on. I changed my priorities to move here and be with her. Time is precious, Vince. We both know that. Automatic weapon fire echoed in Vince's head. The smell of dust, gunfire, and blood. The shouts, anger, surprise, hurt. Vince managed a stiff nod. He knew all too well how life could be cut short without warning. If Jill can just stay married to me until I can convince my grandfather to sell, then Aldo will sell the Bella Vista over his dead body. Sam rubbed his temples, and then he stopped and stared at Vince. That could be another dozen years. Vince nodded slowly, tamping down frustration, trying to control his emotions. Because he couldn't let them loose, or he feared he'd never get them back under control again. If you love Jill, reconsider uprooting her as an option. Sam shook his head as he spoke. In fact, rethink everything that might benefit Aldo. Make hard choices with Jill's best interests in mind. Love is a balm to the bad stuff. But more importantly, love is the joy that makes life make sense. I can't just leave my grandfather to his own devices. But Vince was afraid if he looked deep enough, he'd find he wanted to. He saved me from my abusive father. I owe him everything. Then you need to tell Jill that he comes before she does, Sam whispered, glancing around the bakery, not that there was anyone to listen. Jessica was bidding farewell to a couple heading out the door. If I tell Jill I'm not willing to stay here, she'll divorce me, for sure. Once she fell in love with him, she'd see how moving to Vegas made sense for all of them. Vince wasn't a gambler. He'd learned his lesson earlier than most and avoided risk. But for his marriage, for the chance at a future by Jill's side, he was willing to be less than honest. An hour later, Teddy flung his backpack onto the floorboards of the front seat before climbing into Jill's SUV next to Vince. "Dad, are you taking me to soccer practice?" "Sure am," Vince said brightly, eager to spend more time alone with the boy and learn how to be a dad. "Your mom is feeding retreat guests. She put your soccer bag in the back seat. And after practice, we're going shopping." "For video games?" Teddy asked, hope in his brown eyes, so like his memory of Jill's. How fun it would be to see his joy on Christmas morning. "I need clothes and some other things," Vince said cryptically, thinking of the list he dictated into his phone while cleaning. He selected the location of a soccer field on the dashboard of Jill's SUV just as she'd instructed. Not video games," Teddy said mournfully. "I hate shopping." "It's not like we're shopping for vegetables," Vince teased. "And since I'll probably be buying you dinner, you aren't going to have to eat more vegetables at dinner tonight." "Mom remembers," Teddy said in that woe-is-me dramatic tone. "She never forgets, unlike Glamma." Vince drove out of town. "I guess your tire didn't get fixed." Teddy took out a math book, a pencil, and a sheet of paper. "That's a shame." "Not if it means I get to spend more time with you." Vince turned onto a 2-lane road lined with eucalyptus trees that formed a boundary around what looked to be newly planted vineyards. "Did you and Mom fight?" Teddy flipped open his math book. "Today? No? Why?" "I mean, before I was born. Is that why you haven't been around?" "The only thing Mom ever says about you is that you weren't ready to be a dad." Presuming Teddy didn't know how he was conceived, this was tricky ground. Vince chose his words carefully. "In a way, that's true. I wasn't ready to be a father. We were young, and I had things I needed to do." "Like what?" Teddy's head was bent over his homework, but his pencil wasn't moving. "I went to college. We could have come with you. And I was a Marine, serving overseas." "That's where you got that limp." Teddy glanced at Vince's leg. "I guess we couldn't have come with you then." Vince shook his head. "And then I went to work for my grandfather. He owns a very large hotel and casino in Las Vegas. He's old and can't be left alone for long. Like Glamma." Teddy no longer tried to peek at Vince. He stared openly at him. "We could have come to live with you." "You could have," Vince agreed. "You still could. But then you'd have to leave Harmony Valley." Teddy looked thoughtful and let the conversation drop. 20 minutes later, they reached the soccer field. Teddy changed into shorts in the SUV, while Vince stood watch to make sure no one noticed anything inappropriate. And then Teddy ran toward the soccer field, and Vince joined a cluster of parents sitting in chairs along the sidelines. "This is my dad," Teddy said proudly to no one in particular before running out to join the rest of the team. "Hey." Vince nodded as if being introduced as someone's father was no big deal. And the looks he got, it had been a long time since Vince had felt such scrutiny. Such sizing up and judgment, not since he'd been in business school. "They look at me as if I'm the competition." Vince moved to stand apart from the parents, hands buried in the deep pocket of his hoodie, taking in the practice and players. The coach was a thin, wiry man with the build of a runner. He wore a black tracksuit and a whistle, the latter of which he wasn't afraid to use. "Whistle. Line up. William, lead the warm-up. Whistle. Theodore, eyes on the field." Uh-oh. Teddy had been waving at Vince. "Whistle. Cone drills. Form 2 lines. Whistle. Theodore, focus on your footwork." Uh-oh. Teddy had finished weaving through the cones and had stopped to wave at Vince again. Vince made a shooing motion with his hand. One of the dads on the sidelines ambled over to Vince's side. He cleared his throat. "A word of advice? This is travel ball. Your kid can't be distracted." Warning bells went off in Vince's head. He gave the man a cold stare. "It's just practice." The man shook his head. He wore blue jeans, a hunter's camouflage jacket, and smelled of sunscreen. "You don't get it. This is an exclusive team. Kids want to be here because they have dreams of playing at the next level. High school, college, pro ball. Your son's a scrub, on trial. If he doesn't take this seriously, he won't be welcome here. Vince frowned. All those soccer trophies in Teddy's room, they hadn't been participation trophies. They'd been first-place trophies, MVP. Soccer is important to Teddy, more than a game played for fun. Vince couldn't ruin this for him. You're right, I'm a distraction. What should I do? Go wait in your car. Chances like this don't come along often. The man returned to his folding chair. He leaned over and said something to a woman sitting next to him. Vince backed up a few paces, hoping Teddy wouldn't notice. Teddy noticed. He kicked the ball too hard and missed the curl around a cone. He stopped and stared apprehensively at Vince. I left something in the car, Vince called, feeling like he was letting Teddy down but not wanting to ruin his chances to make the team. I'll be right back. Dad, Teddy ran to the sidelines. Don't go. Whistle. The coach began striding toward the sideline, toward Vince and Teddy. I'm going to watch you, Vince reassured Teddy, but you need to stop watching me. The soccer coach reached them. He was tan but too thin, and his features were as sharp as his whistle. Theodore, return to your drills. But now, the coach said in a tone that wasn't open to argument. Teddy's shoulders slumped, but he headed back to the cones in the middle of the field. Vince was reminded of himself at that age. In the eyes of his father, he couldn't do anything right. And this man wasn't right for Teddy. He was certain of it. The coach turned his disapproving frown Vince's way. This is a middle-grade travel soccer team, Mr. Patrizio. We're not out here to provide boys with a social outlet or a chance to bond with absentee fathers. We're here to field a highly disciplined, winning team. Alarm charged up Vince's spine, squared his shoulders, threatened to ball his fists. It wasn't the words the coach had chosen as much as his tone. It gave the man's character away. Vince couldn't count the number of times he'd met jerks like this, starting with his father. Self-important, power creeps who got their jollies lording over others. The type made Vince sick. Their one weakness, perhaps their only weakness, was that they could be bought. Vince's foreboding found a focus, in the hardening of his features, in the ice in his tone. Travel teams usually need sponsors, don't they? Vince held out the chest of his hoodie. The Railroad Stop Retreat would like to sponsor your program. The coach laughed, long and loud, like every self-important dude who'd ever underestimated Vince. If your son is good enough to stay on the team in a more permanent role, he'll pay an individual sponsorship, just like all the other qualified players. I meant. And here Vince paused to give the coach a supremely chilly stare. The Railroad Stop Retreat would like to sponsor every player. And then Vince shrugged, returning his hands to his pockets. That is, if it's a team deserving of our sponsorship. We don't want to be associated with an organization lacking moral fiber. As you said, middle school is when boys make a transition into teenagers. They need good role models, not put-downs. Here, someone said. The coach glared at the group of parents, and then he turned to Vince, pointy chin thrust out. My record speaks for itself. Your son is being given a chance that few are offered. We'll see how Teddy feels about you at the end of the night. Meaning, Vince didn't care what the coach thought of Teddy. The power was in Teddy's court. Oh, Vince felt good. He felt real good. The coach walked back on the field, and his next whistle sounded less abusive somehow. Vince wished it wasn't. He'd love to get rid of this man. Why don't you join us? The man who'd given him advice earlier offered Vince a chair. No one's ever talked to the coach that way before. A woman bundled under a blanket smiled at Vince. No one needed to before, said a woman with her nose in a book. His divorce is changing him, and not for the better. He needed a reality check, someone else said. Or to be replaced, someone from the end of the row added, giving Vince food for thought. You aren't really going to pay for all our sponsorships, are you? Someone else asked. I'm a man of my word, Vince said, and he meant it. Dad guilt was real. I thought you could use an extra pair of hands. Annie entered the kitchen at the Railroad Stop Retreat after dinner was complete, took an apron from a hook, and put it on. She joined Jill at the sink. Jill was elbow-deep in hot, sudsy water in the pot she was scrubbing. She'd shed her holiday sweater for this task and wore an old Railroad Stop Retreat t-shirt. Don't give me lame excuses, Annie. You wanted to see how Vince and I are doing. Good luck with that. I don't know myself. Busted. Annie grinned and started to load a dishwasher with glasses. Glamma couldn't stop talking about him at dinner tonight. Not many people make such a good impression on her. Except Sam, of course. By the end of her shift, she remembered his name. Jill smiled fondly at the memory. Glamma's been having trouble remembering things lately. I know, Annie sounded worried. You don't point it out to her, do you? That only upsets her. No, I tease her. Jill explained about Glamma not being sure if her shift was starting or ending this morning. How much longer do we let her drive? She could motor right past this place and end up in Napa. Let her? Annie shook her head, dumping handfuls of cutlery in the dishwasher. We'd need a doctor's order. She values her independence. As will we when we're her age. Jill deemed the pot clean, dumped the water out, and began spraying it with hot rinse from the faucet hose. Have you noticed she's signed up for fewer activities lately? I don't think she's as naive about her memory blips as we think. I agree, but don't think I didn't notice how smoothly you changed the subject from Vince to Glamma. Annie began the puzzle of loading various serving dishes into the tray. Glamma said something about private time and mistletoe. Jill stared up at the ceiling above the location where she'd nearly done more than peck Vince's cheek. There was no mistletoe. In fact, the only place at the retreat where there was mistletoe was on the tall branches of an old oak tree. Annie gave Jill a searching look. For years you've had that same look on your face when you think about Vince. You're making that up. Jill set the pot she'd rinsed on the drain board and reached for another that had been soaking. Nope, it's your tell. Annie leaned over the sink to catch Jill's eye. It's like you're remembering how great Jessica's carrot cake is and weighing ordering a slice against all the calories you know is in her cream cheese frosting. Jill chuckled. Her cousin knew her too well. There's my Jilly. Annie returned her attention to loading the dishwasher. Jill stopped scrubbing. Jilly? You haven't called me that since. Before your parents sent you to Las Vegas your senior year, Annie nodded. Because you came back as Jill. You didn't let yourself dream about things very often after that, at least not things like love and happiness the way Jilly did. Love and happiness, Jill said, shaking her head. Here we go again. We can only hope, Jilly. Chapter 7. Vince entered Jill's living room after 9 that night with shopping bags in his arms, hanging off his arms, and gripped in his hands. With a nod to Jill, who was making a shopping list in the kitchen, Vince went right into Teddy's bedroom. How'd it go? Jill asked, watching the open door for Teddy. Having received a phone call earlier from another soccer mom, she knew how soccer practice went. But she wanted to give Vince a chance to confess that he'd meddled where he had no right. Great, Vince called from the bedroom, making Jill grit her teeth. Teddy's homework is done. He really hit his stride at soccer practice. Made some good friends and a couple goals. And miracle of miracles, I've got clean clothes, with more arriving tomorrow, having been sent by my assistant this afternoon. Do you need that many clothes? And she thought Annie was a clothes horse. I told Dad he couldn't buy more than he could carry. Teddy trundled in through the office, carrying his backpack and soccer bag on his shoulders and dragging a large bag with a sporting goods logo behind him. Dad was great. Coach didn't yell half as bad as usual, and I got new cleats and shin guards, plus a new soccer ball and a sports bag, and a hoodie that isn't black and doesn't say Railroad Stop Retreat. Teddy dropped all his bags and collapsed on the sofa. The only way this day could have been better was if we brought home a puppy. Oh, really? Jill crossed her arms. Anything else happen? No. Vince leaned his head out of her son's bedroom, looking attractively disheveled, as if he'd been putting on and taking off clothes without regard to his appearance. Should something else have happened? Did we forget anything, Teddy? Just a puppy. Teddy sat up and looked at Jill. Should we have gotten Dad a Christmas tree to decorate? We passed by a couple of lots on the way home. Oh, and a stocking. Jill tossed her hands. I'm talking about the Railroad Stop Retreat sponsoring the soccer team, which was preposterous. She couldn't afford that. Vince quirked a brow. We're the team sponsor? Teddy threw up his hands and danced around the living room. Yay! Last year a plumber sponsored us. We're way cooler than a plumber, Mom. He ran over to Jill and gave her a hearty hug. Thanks. Jill almost caved into the sponsorship without a fight. Almost. The sponsorship was my idea. I'm covering it, Vince assured her, smiling. We'll discuss your involvement later, Vince, Jill said in a chilly tone. Right now, Teddy needs to take a shower and get to bed. It's late and a school night. And the funny thing was, Teddy hurried off to do just that without another word. Just when I'm convinced that Vince is a bad influence. When the bathroom door was closed and the shower turned on, Jill gathered her son's various bags, walked toward Teddy's room, and gestured for Vince to follow. His shopping bags covered the bottom bunk. She set Teddy's by his desk. You bought enough clothes to stay a long time, Jill noted. Not to mention whatever your assistant sends you. She glanced around the small room. I don't know where you're going to store it all. Didn't know what I'd need. I can always store clothes in my car, when I get it back, that is. Hands in his pockets, Vince smiled tentatively at Jill. What did I do wrong? Jill folded her legs and sat on the carpet, leaning her back against the bottom bunk bed rail. I don't know where to start, other than to mention that you aren't authorized to market the railroad stop retreat. And just offering to sponsor Teddy smacks of nepotism. He needs to prove he's good enough to make the team. Yeah, about that. Vince sat next to her. I'm not sure Coach Carl is the right coach for Teddy. The right coach? Jill's head dropped back on the mattress. Do you know how hard it is to get invited to try out for a travel team? No, Vince said softly, but I know how scarring it is to be under the thumb of the wrong sort of power figure. Jill lifted her head, heart in her throat, when she looked at Vince. He wouldn't. But if anyone would know about unworthy power figures, it was Vince. Jill wrapped her arms around her legs and held on tight. I can't believe this. I'm a bad mom for putting him in that situation. How am I going to tell Teddy that he can't be on the team? He's so excited about it. Well, Vince rubbed a hand back and forth over her shoulders, which felt heavenly after scrubbing pots all evening. Coach Carl acted far better with the opportunity of a sponsorship on the line. And after talking with the other parents, I learned he's going through a very contentious divorce and not acting like himself. Coach Carl's son is that tall goalie, the one with anger issues. The breakup of a marriage can have repercussions, you know. Jaw-dropping, Jill turned her head to look at Vince. You got all that from the parents? They wouldn't even talk to me. They're all worried Teddy will take someone's spot. Vince stopped his shoulder massage and gave Jill a mischievous grin. Or at least, they were until I offered to sponsor the team and make sure all the kids were on the roster. I don't know whether to thank you or curse you. Truly. What happens when you're gone? That seemed to unnerve Vince. His grin fell, and his gaze grew guarded. He's not telling me something. And since she owed him a share, Jill stopped herself from prying. Not that she was at a loss for other topics of conversation. She gestured toward Teddy's big bag with his new soccer gear. You shouldn't be spoiling Teddy. You may have forgotten, but we're getting a divorce. That's still under negotiation. Vince took her hand, turning it over until the wrist burn from this morning was exposed. He kissed the skin next to it and then looked into her eyes. I love you, Jill. She wanted to deny his feelings, not to mention hers. But his touch was warm and gentle, the way a spouse's touch was supposed to be, and the emotion shining in his eyes was bright and tender, the way a spouse's lingering looks were supposed to be. And just like that, Jill was thinking of kisses, not contracts that ended marriages. I love you. Vince brushed Jill's hair away from her face. I've been practicing saying that for over a decade. How does it sound? Wonderful, impractical, scary, Jill blurted. Let's start with the wonderful, Vince prompted softly. Scary is a better choice. The biggest of obstacles, her chest suddenly felt tight enough to stifle her breath. Why scary, honey? You like it when I hold your hand. Vince's voice was as soft and smooth as a new velvet pillow and just as enticing. You like it when our eyes meet. She nodded. She may have been a coward when it came to consummating her marriage, but she didn't want to be one. She wanted to be Jilly, starry-eyed and trusting. How would you feel if I kissed you again? Vince's smooth, gentle voice drew her closer. I like kissing you. Slowly, he leaned over and pressed a kiss to her temple. That's not the kiss I wanted. But, after taking a breath, Jill realized she didn't feel like running for the hills the way she had the 2 other times he'd kissed her. That was nice. I know a little bit about what it's like to be scared. Vince was no longer looking at Jill. He stared at a poster of soccer star Lionel Messi taking a shot on goal. I told you that I lived with my grandfather. I think I even told you that my parents weren't cut out to be parents. Jill nodded. But what I didn't tell you was that my father had anger issues. Vince rubbed a hand over his cheek. There was a small scar near his eye, like a nick made from a ring when a punch was struck. His hand found hers again. But his eyes, they were still trained on the soccer poster. And even though things were better with my grandfather, he came over here from Italy. You've met him. He can be loud, just like my father. You didn't know if you'd been dropped out of the frying pan and into the fire, Jill guessed. Vince nodded, tracing the length of her ring finger with his thumb, stopping to trace the shape of her single stone wedding ring. Turns out, my grandfather's temper is expressed in volume, not physical impact. I'm so glad. Jill covered his hand with her own. But then you left, and his gaze met hers, dark and soulful. I felt used. Oh, she had used him. I'm sorry. His gaze drifted to her hand, perhaps to her ring. Then there was my grandfather grooming me to take over the company. That's why you were angry in college. That's why you didn't contact me. He nodded. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all, she finished for him. I deserved that anger. Vince shook his head. You deserved a fresh start, and that's what I gave you. Jill's breath caught. But who'll give you a fresh start? You deserve to life your own life. Do I? His smile was as sad as the shadows in his eyes. She brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. You do. My grandfather wants me to carry on his legacy. I owe him that. Vince's words were stiff, stilted, his gaze averted. He protected me, and you protected me, she thought. What do I owe you? It feels like a legacy you don't want, Jill pointed out gently, taking Vince's hand and running her thumb over his wedding ring, wondering how best to support him. And if Teddy decides he doesn't want to run this retreat when you're no longer able? Vince asked unexpectedly. After all the work you've put in, wouldn't you want to see the retreat live on? Jill rubbed a hand over her chest, trying to ease the tightness there. I want him to be happy. It would be hard to let go, but I'd do it if that's what he wanted. My grandfather would disagree. He's old school about family, legacy, and what you leave behind. Vince laced their fingers together. And that's my long-winded answer to your question about why I didn't divorce you. I wanted you to be happy. But you'd like to have a happy ending, too. Jill's mind worked through that thought for a moment or two. That's another reason why you haven't divorced me, he nodded. Because I love you, and as long as we stay married, I have something to hang on to in the future. Something of his own. That was a powerful message. And Jill didn't know how to respond. What are you guys doing sitting on the floor? Teddy wore pajama bottoms, his wet, brown hair stood on end, and when he saw his parents holding hands, he grinned. Were you talking about what to get me for Christmas? Yes, Vince said, while Jill said firmly, no. She got to her feet. 30 minutes of reading, and then it's lights out. She kissed the top of Teddy's head and left the room. Where's my goodnight kiss? Vince heaved a sigh. He supposed giving Jill food for thought was enough. Teddy turned to face Vince. Are you grounded for buying all that stuff? Did she ask you to leave? No and no. Vince got to his feet and set about organizing his new clothes into piles. All the shirts together, all the slacks together. I'm staying, at least until he convinced Jill not to divorce him, and perhaps until he convinced her to move to Vegas. Yay! Teddy surprised Vince with a hug. His arms and torso still had that steamy, damp feel. I wish I was still in kindergarten so I could bring you in to show and tell at school. I'm your dad. That was becoming easier to say. Not your favorite trophy. Vince gestured toward the trophies on the windowsill. I know. Teddy removed his school clothes from his backpack and stuffed them in the laundry basket in his closet, frowning the way he did sometimes when it seemed like he was years older than 11. It's just that when we were at that funeral with you a couple of weeks ago, I had this giant ball of worry in my stomach. like when I eat too many slices of pizza too fast. He looked at Vince, perhaps gauging his interest or reaction. I've been there. Vince nodded. But for me, it was all-you-can-eat buffets. His attempt at humor didn't land the way he thought it would. Teddy's old soul frown deepened. What I'm saying is, I did not want to be that dead guy's son. Not in any way. But then you said he was your friend from school, and inside I was like, so relieved. Mom calls it being in a good place. He stood as if searching for something in the room he couldn't find, or perhaps it was words he was searching for because he tossed his hands. But then you went back on radio silence, which was a bummer. Like, a huge disappointment. And Mom was sad. She's been sad. That's encouraging to hear. I was sad too, Vince admitted, but I had work and my grandfather to take care of. A duty to fulfill. Yeah, but now you're here. Teddy grabbed a Percy Jackson book from his shelf and climbed onto the top bunk. And if Mom and I play our cards right, you'll stay. The truth rose up in Vince's throat. He swallowed it back down. We'll figure it out, he hoped. Chastity Chapter 8. What's this? Jill emerged from her bedroom the next morning in the darkness before dawn. She was used to being the only one up and about at that time of day, so it was a surprise to find Vince in the kitchen. Couldn't you sleep? Is that why you're making breakfast? Which smelled heavenly. I got up early to make you breakfast. Vince flipped a pancake and then began turning bacon. The grease popped and sizzled, making him leap back, perhaps protective of his new blue shirt and gray slacks. Coffee's ready. Pour yourself a cup and then we'll sit down and eat together. It's nearly 6. I don't have time to eat. Jill poured herself a cup of coffee anyway, liberally dosing it with creamer. I need to prepare breakfast for my guests. I'll finish up here and help you. Vince smiled. It was of the low-key variety, non-threatening, fond even. Jill knew she should refuse. She'd spent much of last night lying awake and thinking about him, wondering if she should give a relationship with him a try. Here, in Harmony Valley, where she felt safe. I'd appreciate the help, Jill said instead, because it was true. Running the retreat and raising a son was a lonely, taxing business, and Vince was making it hard not to imagine him running it with her. Thank you. A few minutes later, armed with coffee and fueled by a quick breakfast, they walked toward the main dining hall in the 2-story guest building. The path lighting was powered by solar and dimming. They passed a stack of paint cans behind a bit of shrubbery near where Jill parked. The wind had blown the tarp covering them off. Jill paused to recover them. Renovating? Vince asked as they resumed their pace. I had planned to, but life got in the way this summer. I made it as far as buying paint and unloading the cans from my SUV. Since she hadn't put them to use, Jill would need to find a place to store the cans in the already overcrowded storage shed. Vince sipped his coffee, appearing incredibly casual despite his casual workday attire and a new black wool coat. Just a fresh coat of paint? More than that. I want to update the rooms. They're looking a little sad. And sadly, rundown rooms didn't command living wage rates. Some of my friends think I should make the rooms social media worthy. You know, themed rooms and walls that make interesting backdrops for photos. Sounds smart to me. A rustle in the bushes ahead had Vince stepping in front of Jill. Stay back. There's some kind of animal ahead. The bushes rustled again, accompanied by a low, gusty growl. It's all right. Jill patted Vince's shoulder as she eased around him, continuing up the path. It's Susie. She's a raccoon and this is her territory. As long as you stay on the path, she'll stay in the bushes. Vince fell into step next to Jill. Is that safe for guests? I have video cameras around the property. Susie doesn't usually pass through until about 6. I've never seen her around during the day. Trust me, she's more afraid of you than you are of her. Jill opened the door to the dining hall and turned on the lights. Colorful material and in-progress quilts were strewn about, left next to sewing machines, on top of sewing boxes, or folded on tables. You don't lock your doors, Vince asked. I lock the office and house doors. Jill picked up empty coffee mugs someone had left on a table last night before heading toward the kitchen. But my guests appreciate the fact that they can gather here 24/7. And yes, I've been robbed a few times, but they stole weird things, like toilet paper, towels, and large garden rocks. never anything from inside the kitchen or dining hall. "It's not if, but when," Vince said in a dour voice, gathering some used napkins from another table. "I do what works for me, Vince." Jill entered the kitchen, flipped on the lights, and froze. The large industrial refrigerator door was open. A pair of large cowboy boots were visible beneath it. But whoever was raiding the fridge wasn't visible behind the door. Fear shuddered through Jill, locking her limbs in place. Guests aren't allowed in here. And those boots didn't look like anything one of her sewing circle guests would wear. "Who's there?" Vince came around to stand in front of Jill once more, and this time she was grateful. "Who are you?" The refrigerator door closed to reveal, "Glamma?" Jill rushed forward, setting the dirty mugs in the sink before taking her grandmother by the shoulders, her cold shoulders. "How long have you been standing there? Are you all right?" Am I early for my shift?" Glamma stared blankly at Vince. "My coworker is here." Jill might have laughed if her grandmother hadn't looked so disheveled and out of sorts. Her blonde hair didn't look as if she'd brushed it, and she wore no makeup, none. And her attire, Glamma wore one of her favorite flowing skirts and an equally flowy pink sweater, but no jewelry. And her footwear, they didn't look like anything her grandmother had ever worn. They lacked any feminine, flashy showgirl vibes. "Are those Grandpa's cowboy boots?" "I think they are." Glamma stared at her feet. "Funny, I don't remember putting them on this morning." "Glamma, why don't you come sit down at the table?" Vince led her to a chair at a table in the corner without waiting for her to agree. "Jill's going to get you a glass of water." "I'd rather have a large coffee," Glamma murmured, taking a seat. "Drink the water first," Vince said with just the right amount of firm persuasion in his tone, that sitting down across from her at the table. Jill filled a glass with water and brought it to her grandmother, who dutifully drank some. Outside of the kitchen, the door in the dining hall opened and closed. Someone was up early. Vince heard it too. "You should get that coffee started, Jill, and then we'll call the doctor." "Yes." Jill hurried to make the coffee, preheat the oven, and take the pans of breakfast casserole she'd made last night out of the fridge before calling Glamma's doctor. She left a message with his service. And all the while, Vince kept up a steady stream of conversation with Glamma. "You performed at the Tropicana? They tore that down recently." "They tear down all the good ones." Glamma drained her water glass. "When you have a moment, I'd be tremendously grateful for a cup of joe." She reached across the table and took hold of Vince's chin. "You do look like Aldo Patrizio. I never met him, but it's in your eyes, that dark determination." Glamma released him. "It's funny that I don't see it in Teddy's eyes. His are full of mischief." Jill thought so too. Thankfully, Teddy showed none of the traits of his biological father. "Unlike Jill's eyes," Glamma continued, "most days her eyes reflect nothing but work, work, work. I'd like to bring back a little spark to those pretty brown eyes." Vince placed his elbows on the table, more than his fair share of mischief in those black eyes when he looked at Jill. "She and I used to get into a bit of mischief ourselves when we were in school." "Do tell," Glamma said eagerly. "There's nothing to tell. We were boring students who never cut class." Jill sliced pieces of fruit, arranging them on a tray. "Except that one time," Vince laughed. "During homecoming week, we stole the principal's desk and put it on the roof of the school office." "Oh." Jill had forgotten about that. She smiled. It had been fun to do something completely out of character. "However, did you manage that?" Glamma tucked her hair back, all ears. "I'll never tell," Vince said, all light and warmth and secrets. Secrets only we share. Jill liked that. The oven beeped, and Jill slid the breakfast casseroles in, setting the timer on the stove in case she had to take Glamma to the hospital. "Jill will tell me." Glamma turned toward her, eyes looking clearer. "Nope, I've been sworn to silence." But Jill remembered her surprise when Vince drove up in a forklift to meet her at school in the dead of night. Vince had never copped to how he'd gotten keys to the forklift, or the school, not to mention the security code for entry. And they'd never told anyone at school what they'd done. But the prank probably lives on in the school's mythology. "That reminds me of something you might have done with Annie when you were younger," Glamma said absently. "You grew up to be the staid and stern one of the bunch, didn't you? I never would have guessed." A part of Jill wanted to argue that she hadn't turned out that way by choice, but she kept those thoughts to herself, wiping down counters that were already clean. Appearances can be deceiving. Vince leaned toward Glamma, but his eyes were on Jill, that troublemaking smile still on his lips. "Do you know what I love most about Jill?" Glamma shook her head. "That she's always there when you need her, in good times and bad, through thick and thin." Vince's grin widened. "And she's always up for an adventure." Jill's grandmother scoffed before Jill could. "That was then. She's predictable now, never doing anything that isn't scheduled weeks in advance." A part of Jill wanted to protest, to give her grandmother an example that contradicted her predictableness. But she couldn't think of anything. Is Jill predictable? There's that homecoming prank. Vince defended Jill's honor, earning a smile from Jill. And your marriage, I suppose. Both of which were your doing more than hers, I'd wager. Glamma ran a hand through her hair, gasped, and then looked stricken. "I blame the time change." "For what?" Jill brought her a cup of coffee. "Spring forward, fall back. That's why I'm here so early, without product in my hair." Glamma touched her cheeks. "Or color on my face." And Jill might have pretended to believe her grandmother's excuses if the doctor hadn't decided to call her back at that moment and wanted Glamma to head straight to the emergency room for tests. It wasn't until she sat in the waiting room with Glamma that Jill considered herself lucky to have Vince available to care for her guests and make sure Teddy got to school on time. There were advantages to having a husband on the premises. More advantages than the occasional kiss. "Why does your mom love Christmas so much?" Vince asked Teddy as he drove Jill's SUV over the summit toward the switchbacked road on the other side that led to town. Wearing a blue Christmas sweater with pairs of mittens stitched on it, Jill had left in Glamma's car when they'd headed toward the hospital in Cloverdale. "There must be a reason," Vince wondered aloud. "I think of Christmas as a day, but for your mom, it's more a state of mind." "Nah, it's presents," Teddy deadpanned in a surprisingly deep voice, as if he was on the verge of a voice change. "No," Vince grinned. "That would be why you love Christmas. She loves all of it. Trees, stockings, lights, Christmas carols." Teddy shrugged. "She's always talking about how holiday traditions bring her joy." "Christmas brings her joy," Vince murmured. There was safety in all those traditions, innocence in all that sparkle and beauty, and she'd surrounded herself in it everywhere, but in the retreat's large kitchen. Vince pulled up in front of Martin's Bakery. Teddy turned in his seat to face Vince. "Can I come inside?" "I don't see why not, as long as we get in and out of here quickly." He checked the time on the dashboard. "We have 20 minutes to get you to school." Together, they entered the bakery. Together, like any father and son would. That brought a smile to Vince's face. Not surprisingly, all conversation stopped upon their arrival, giving the chorus of "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen" center stage. Vince gave an easygoing wave and headed toward the bakery case. It had fir boughs with shiny baubles on top and was filled with baked goods decorated in a cheery red and green. "Coffee, black, 2 shots of espresso," Vince told Jessica. He'd gotten up very early and he was going to be cleaning rooms again today while juggling calls, messages, and emails from Bella Vista staff. "And Teddy wants." Vince turned around, but Teddy wasn't behind him. "And after practice, my dad took me to get new soccer gear." Teddy's chest was puffed out with pride as he talked to a pair of old men sitting on opposite sides of a checkerboard. Isn't he great? Sometimes Teddy seemed so mature and wise. Other times, like now, he seemed like an innocent kid. "Hot chocolate and a bagel?" Jessica suggested, interrupting Vince's thoughts. "Yes." Vince turned back around, digging for his wallet. "As long as the bagel doesn't have horseradish." Jessica staggered back dramatically. "I'm mortally wounded, and for that I'm going to give you another horseradish scone, Vince." "Oh, please don't plant your stake on Horseradish Hill." Vince gave the baker his most charming of smiles. "Honestly, I'm fine with my supercharged coffee." Immune to his charm, Jessica smirked as she dropped the scone into a bakery bag. "We take our horseradish seriously around here." That was the mountain-sized old man with the white blonde beard and long hair to match. "Ruckar." Teddy hurried over to the table in the back where the mountain man sat. "That's my dad. Isn't he great?" "That remains to be seen." Rutgar sipped his coffee, giving Vince the stink eye. You can tell a lot about a man by his affinity to horseradish. I'm sure he'll love it, Rutgar. That was Teddy, the traitor. It wasn't as if he was fond of the ingredient. We'll win him over? Jessica handed Vince 2 bakery bags, a challenge in her eyes. Horseradish is the new cinnamon. Noted. Vince paid, then moved to the end of the bakery case to wait for their drinks. That's 2 Vinces we have in town now, the thin, elderly woman who'd twirled Vince around yesterday said. How are we going to keep them straight? Vince 1 and Vince 2. The ponytailed old man wore a blue and white tie-dyed hoodie today. He pointed at Vince. You'll be Vince 2, of course. Vince didn't find second place appealing. Pfft. Thankfully, a pixie-sized woman waved that suggestion away. She turned to Vince. What's your full name, dear? Vince glanced toward Jessica, but his drink order wasn't ready, which meant he had to answer. Vincenzo Leonardo Patrizio. 3 O's, the woman who looked like Mrs. Claus whispered, and then she spoke louder. That's triple O to you, everybody. Triple O? That won't work as a name, one of the checker players said, entering the chat. I'd call him Leo. My name is Vince, Vince muttered, vowing not to answer to Leo. If you call him Leo, said Mrs. Claus with more than a bit of spunk, I'll always be looking around for Leonardo DiCaprio. Not that she'd be able to identify him whether she was wearing those thick glasses or not. He is kind of a hunk, though, the pixie-sized old woman said, softening her sexist remark with a kindly smile toward Vince. But then again, so is Vince one. Your order's ready. Jessica handed Vince 2 cups. Best make a run for it before they start renaming Teddy. Not needing to be told twice, Vince headed for the door. Let's roll, Teddy. Teddy said goodbye to people in the bakery while Vince waited at the door, trying not to listen to further suggestions regarding the renaming of Vince number 2. It took a minute for Teddy to finish his goodbyes, although it felt more like an eternity. The bakery was full, and Teddy wasn't skipping anyone. Finally, Vince and Teddy were buckling their seatbelts in the SUV. Now I know why your mother makes you wait in the car. Vince waved to the purple-haired grandma sitting in the window seat. You're a social butterfly. I'm not, Teddy insisted. I'm a kid with good news to share, and I'm going to keep sharing it until everybody knows. Or your dad leaves. Vince's shoulders pinched. It's about time you called me. Aldo Patrizio's gruff voice rumbled through Vince's earbuds as he cleaned a room at the retreat. I approve of you trying to make up with your wife, but I'm not a fan of my second-in-command working so far away from home. It's called working from home, and things are running smoothly there. Which was a surprise. It was as if everyone knew how important this trip was to Vince. He tugged the bed linens tightly across the mattress. I'll get right to the point. I haven't heard from our lawyers about the Salazars. Do you have an update? No, and you won't hear from them until we send in DNA tests and receive the results, his grandfather grumbled. The Salazars have already submitted Brian's DNA to court. We overnighted DNA kits to you with your travel bag. Personally, I think you should swab your mouth twice and send them in as samples from yourself and my great-grandson. That's not how these tests work. Vince fluffed the pillows and set them against the headboard. The 2 samples will be a perfect match and throw up red flags. If Teddy was my biological son, we'd share DNA, not be a match. His grandfather swore in Italian. We might just as well gift-wrap the boy and deliver him to the Salazar's doorstep for the weekend. While his grandfather went on a rant, Vince moved into the bathroom, trying not to be bothered by the 60-some-year-old fixtures and furniture. Jill was about 20 years or so behind in her renovations. When his grandfather took a breath, Vince reminded him, We won't lie. That won't help anyone. I'll get Jill's permission to do the test on Teddy and we'll go from there. But at some point, Teddy would need to be told the truth about his parentage. Because Vince was certain that it was going to come down to the boy testifying about what he wanted, the truth needed telling before then. How have you been feeling? Vince asked, spraying down the toilet with disinfectant. I'm the picture of health, his grandfather said more loudly than before. I'm going to live to see 100. Just you wait and see. Vince refused to be demoralized by that comment, since it meant more years apart from Jill if she wouldn't move from Harmony Valley. But he couldn't wish his grandfather ill. He took out his frustration by wiping down the commode as if it needed a good scrubbing. Can we talk about our family Christmas traditions? I'd like to share them with Jill. She loves this time of year, and my memory of our traditions is fuzzy. There was a witch who brought me presents, wasn't there? Although not on Christmas. La Befana, he chuckled. According to Italian folklore, it was supposed to be 3 wise men and an Italian witch named La Befana that traveled to Bethlehem. Only the witch got lost, so she returned to Italy, where she decided to be a New Year's blessing to families instead. Now, if she hadn't gotten lost, I bet Joseph and Mary would have found a room at the inn. Why do I feel as if La Befana is our Greek Windex myth? Vince teased, thinking about my big fat Greek wedding and the numerous references to the window cleaner being a cure-all. Why do you insist upon talking in riddles? His grandfather countered, although he chuckled. Give Jill a nice broom with a big red bow on January 5th. She'll be pleased. That's about as romantic as buying her a new frying pan for Christmas. Toilet sparkling, Vince moved on to clean the sink next. Not to mention, this witch arrives after Christmas. There must be a more romantic Italian Christmas traditions. Romantic? Again with the chuckle. The old man was getting a kick out of this. I guess leaving a carrot out for St. Lucy's flying donkey won't do then. Now you're just pulling my leg. The scar on his leg throbbed on cue. I suppose you could gift Jill a Christmas village, his grandfather said in a thoughtful tone. Nearly every Italian home has one. Jill has a small village, just a few houses. I suppose she might like to expand it. You can tell her the village has many meanings to Italians, his grandfather continued. If it contains a nativity scene, it conveys the love for the Holy Child, while a town square represents community, safety, and love. Community, safety, and love. 2 of the things that were important to Jill, and the one thing she was lacking, love. I like that. It's settled then. I'll send you ours. And before Vince could protest, the phone line went dead. Chapter 9. The good news is you didn't have a stroke or heart attack, Dr. Prescott told Jill and Glamma around noon. He was a young doctor. His stethoscope looked brand new, but he was handsome and without the ego of some doctors Glamma had run across. I'm not dying then. Glamma sank back on her flat hospital pillow in one of the emergency room cubbies. That's great news. But you didn't pass your cognitive test, which is concerning. The doctor's smile never wavered. It was stuck in neutral, as if a failing grade wasn't the end of Glamma's world. The blood test results might give us a better answer in terms of how to proceed from here. He turned toward Jill. Does she live alone? Before Jill could answer, Glamma tried to press the button that would move her bed into a sitting position. Her torso went backward instead. Blast. Just because I was confused this morning, Dr. Prescott, doesn't mean I can't answer for myself. The doctor pried the bed remote from Glamma's stiff fingers and put her into an upright, sitting position. Well, do you live alone? No, Glamma mumbled, feeling incompetent and more than a little scared. The morning's episode was her worst so far. What was she going to do next? Walk into a neighbor's home in her birthday suit? I don't live alone. I have family living with me. My cousin and her daughter, Jill added, looking more serious than the doctor. Annie works from home. Normally she keeps an eye on Glamma there, and I keep an eye on her at my place. But no one noticed her sneak out this morning. The doctor nodded gravely. It might be best if you took time off from work until we figure this out, Gloria. Gloria? Glamma snorted. Nobody calls me Gloria. Gloria has a walker in a nursing home. She knits while binging Hallmark movies. She wears sweatshirts with appliques for each season. Glamma snorted once more. You're failing the bedside manner test, doctor. I'm Glamma. It says so on my chart. The young lad seemed to shrink back, making her feel bad, but she refused to apologize. He had a lot to learn when it came to interacting with patients, and a thicker skin to develop if that blush on his cheeks was any indication. Gloria sounds laid back and put together, Jill said in a flat voice, interrupting Glamma's internal assessment of the doctor. Jill had been on the side of the medical staff all morning. Gloria sounds like a blessing. Ha! Gloria sounds like she's done with life and waiting for her time to expire, Glamma snapped back. I'm fine. So what if my memory is hiccuping? I'm nearly 80. Can't I eat more carrots or something? Hydrate? Do word puzzles. Those all sound like good ideas. Dr. Prescott nodded, recovering his neutral smile. But it may be that we can add medicine into the mix to bolster your memory function. We just need more test results to determine what our treatment plan will be. If there aren't any more questions, I'll have the nurse process your release paperwork. I'll call you in a day or two with my recommendation. Glamma shooed him out the curtained cubby, and then she turned to Jill. Can we get a second opinion? Jill tossed her hands. He didn't give you an opinion other than to tell you to take it easy, Gloria. Glamma clenched her teeth. It sounds like you'll be diagnosed with some kind of memory issue when your blood work results come in. Jill's expression softened. She eased Glamma's hair away from her face. We both knew this was coming. No way was Glamma admitting that. I'm not slowing down. You're taking me back to the retreat, and I'm getting my work done. If that absentee husband of Jill's hadn't already cleaned all the rooms, he worked fast, as if he had somewhere better to be. You know what happens to the elderly when they slow down? No. Jill's expression bordered on condescending. But I suppose you're going to tell me. They lose their edge, Glamma said with a snap. There'll be no more dancing, no more dating, no more dressing up. I'll cut my hair short, stop wearing makeup, and only take showers once a week. Glamma drama, Jill muttered, shaking her head. If you don't want to age into Gloria, don't. I'm not aging, Glamma protested, as petulant as any overly tired child coming down from a tantrum. I'm just losing it. She refused to admit that. I'm too young to lose my joie de vivre. Jill sat down abruptly in the visitor's chair, and I'm too old to get mine. Chapter 10. What are you doing? Teddy found Vince in the storage shed after Jill picked him up from school on her way back from the hospital with Glamma. I'm looking for paintbrushes and rollers. Your mom bought all that paint. But the shed was more full of spiders and sealed boxes than tools that weren't rusted or bent out of shape. He'd spent half his time inside navigating stacks of junk and squishing arachnids of all sizes and colors with a rag. How had Sam put the ladder so far back? Your mom must have bought brushes and such to put paint on the walls. Squish. One more spider ground to dust. We only bought paint, Teddy said from the shed door near the red wagon. She said we couldn't buy paint and pay for my soccer tryout in the same month. You had to pay to try out for that team? Vince stopped digging through cobwebs and started silently cursing Teddy's soccer coach. He had quite the racket going on. You need to find a new soccer team. Squish. Don't say that. Teddy scuffed his tennis shoe in the dirt. I like my soccer team. They win lots of trophies. You can drive me to soccer practice tomorrow. We have Tuesdays and Thursdays off. He pointed out another spider to kill on the ceiling above Vince's head. You need to be careful in there. Mom refuses to use chemical bug killers. She put herbs or something around the shed last summer. Squish. That explains the smell of lavender. Vince sucked in his waistline as he moved between stacks of boxes, blocking his way toward the door. But if she's going to make those kind of decisions, she should be in charge of bug squishing. Vince stepped out of the shed and then closed the door behind him. He opened an app on his phone. Add painting supplies to my shopping list. Okay, painting supplies added to your list. Teddy peered at Vince's phone. We need to get Glamma a phone assistant, then she won't forget anything. Great idea for a Christmas gift. Vince raised his phone once more, but Teddy stopped him. Can I talk to your phone? That eager expression. Vince couldn't resist. He handed his phone over, pointing out which app he used to keep his life organized. Add a phone assistant to my Christmas gift list, Teddy said in a commanding voice, then added, please and thank you. Okay, phone assistant added to your Christmas gift list. Teddy danced around with Vince's phone. That was fun. What else can we add? I'm sure something will come along. Maybe a Christmas gift for your mom. Or me, Teddy suggested gleefully, and then his brow clouded. You don't have memory problems, do you? That's not why you stayed away so long and have a phone assistant. No. Vince ruffled Teddy's dark brown hair. I'm busy and pulled in all different directions. This way it makes it harder to forget something. Teddy looked thoughtful. He tapped Vince's phone screen. Add a daily reminder that I have a son named Teddy in Harmony Valley. Okay, I'll remind you every day at 8 a.m. that you have a son named Teddy in Harmony Valley. All done. Teddy returned Vince's phone to him. They headed up the path toward the main retreat building. Vince wanted to check if Jill needed help making dinner. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" "A video game designer is the coolest." Teddy didn't exactly skip next to Vince, but didn't exactly not. "Then I'm going to take the fortune I make and buy a soccer team in England. And when I retire, I'm going to come back to run the railroad stop retreat, plus be the mayor of Harmony Valley." That was quite a list. Kudos were called for. Vince patted Teddy on the back. "You have great vision. That must be why you study so hard in school." And since Teddy didn't shy away from his touch, Vince felt like he was getting the hang of this dad thing. "Yep." Teddy moved ahead of Vince and walked backward. "You're going to be here for Christmas, aren't you?" "I'm not sure." And just like that, Vince was flailing in the dad department. He knew that whatever he said next wouldn't be good enough for the boy. "If I promise to try to be here for Christmas, will you help me remodel the guest rooms?" Teddy frowned and stopped walking backward. "Shouldn't you just promise? You're my dad. It's more complicated than that." Vince stood in front of Teddy, searching for something to say that would reassure him. Teddy's frown deepened. "I know what I should have put in your phone. I should have added a real family to your Christmas shopping list. A real family for Teddy. A real family." "I like that, Teddy. I really do. But much as I want to, I can't promise anything right now." His future as part of this little family depended upon Jill. "That's a lie. You could." Teddy's voice rose and his face scrunched, cheeks reddening. "You just don't want to be a family with me." And then he ran off, leaving Vince feeling gutted. "Teddy, come back." Teddy disappeared inside the retreat office, slamming the door behind him. He'd blown it, and still he muttered, "I want to, Teddy, but—" "Sometimes things don't work out the way you want them to," Jill finished for Vince, appearing at his side. "He'll learn that someday." "The hard way, I bet." Vince refused to say that out loud. "Follow me, Vince. I want to show you something." Jill headed off down a narrow trail that disappeared in the pine grove behind the property. Vince did as he was told, hoping for a private conversation that would bring progress. They'd seen each other briefly in the parking when she'd returned from taking Glamma to the hospital. She'd thanked Vince for cleaning rooms and preparing lunch for the guests, but she'd seemed preoccupied and had returned to the office to take care of some accounting. And then she'd returned to town to pick up Teddy from school. So, he'd gone the other way, in search of paint supplies, wondering when Jill would discover the Christmas surprise he'd given her. Jill led Vince beneath a canopy of fragrant pine trees for about 50 yards on a twisting, climbing path. And then suddenly, the trees began to thin and the world to open up. It was the ridge she'd told him about, the one visible from the dining hall, the one on top of the granite-faced Parish Hill where you could overlook Harmony Valley and Napa Valley at the same time. Jill stood on the summit and seemed to take in the view. Vince came to stand beside her. After a moment, he took her hand. Beautiful view. He wasn't looking at the scenery. He was staring at Jill. "When is that new tire coming in?" Jill didn't look at him. "Trying to get rid of me? I thought we make a good team." He'd pitched in today to keep her guests happy like a supportive partner should. In fact, when he'd told her the lawyers had sent the DNA tests for him and Teddy, she'd agreed to it without complaint. He'd taken his test. Presumably, Teddy had taken his with some kind of explanation from Jill. Vince planned to rush the kits back for analysis tomorrow. "You have to admit that we're on the same page in many ways." Jill scrunched her nose, indicating her disagreement. "Teddy's getting attached to you." "I don't mind that," Vince insisted. "I want to be his dad. You couldn't even frame your presents at Christmas." Jill's voice was thin and vulnerable, her shoulders hunched. "Are you saying you want me to be his father full-time?" Vince turned her to face him. "I could promise Teddy the moon if we stay married. If we make this a real marriage. You know I love you. You know what I want. But what do you want, Jill?" "I want." Her gaze lowered to his lips. "I want things I shouldn't wish for. I asked you for a divorce to let you live your life, free of the baggage in mine." Now they were getting somewhere. Somewhere close to the real reason behind him being served divorce papers. "Tell the truth, Jill. I've thought about this a lot since you told me you couldn't be a true wife. Much as Vince wanted to tread gently, he used a tone to discourage argument. I scared you when I kissed you and told you I wanted a real marriage in Vegas a few weeks ago. Your response was to run to a divorce lawyer. If we never kissed and I never told you what I wanted, you would have let this marriage continue. Jill's eyes widened, but she didn't deny anything he said. You're so scared of failing at love that you can't even reach for it when it's standing right in front of you. Vince took her into his arms. Sweetheart, what happened with Brian wasn't the end of your story. It was the beginning of ours. Hope glistened in Jill's eyes. You have a habit of saying just the right thing to undo all my well-thought-out decisions. Now that's progress. I want to kiss you, Jill. So very badly. After a moment of hesitation, her arms twined around his neck. Then kiss me. If he registered the wariness in her eyes, Vince blocked it out. He lowered his lips to hers and kissed her as if she was the most precious of gifts. Because she was. She was the only thing he wanted for Christmas. The wind lifted Jill's hair. The sun shone on her face, and her heart beat at a controlled cadence. Not too fast, not too slow. Vince's kiss was tender, reassuring. She imagined the peacefulness of being in his arms as her normal. I don't need to divorce him. She nestled closer. I could let myself fall in love with him. Maybe she already had, without even realizing it. Maybe that's why she'd proposed to him all those years ago. Vince eased back and brushed the hair from her eyes, and then he sighed, tucking her more securely into his arms, her head beneath his chin. Being with you and Teddy feels so natural, she nodded. Until we remember reality, love doesn't take priority over important responsibilities. They figured out how to put a man on the moon. Vince ran a hand over Jill's hair. Surely we can figure out how to make a marriage work. Jill sighed. You know those people who always win a raffle everywhere they go? He nodded. Lucky fools. Well, I'm not one of them. Jill picked up her well-considered decisions, stepped out of Vince's arms, and moved a few feet away. Things don't work out for me. The wrinkle across his brow matched the thin, wavy set of his lips. He wasn't sure what to say or what to do. A hawk circled above them. Turning her back on Vince, Jill took a moment to appreciate Mother Nature. The fresh tang of unpolluted air, the brisk wind on her face, the same wind that rustled through the treetops. I used to come here and look out on the world thinking I'd conquer it someday, but reality was so much different. Vince moved closer, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. Say something, she said, barely above a whisper. I can't, Vince said in a husky voice. Whatever I say or don't say, you'll use it against us. Not me, us. Jill's heart felt as trapped as Vince seemed to feel. You're right. I don't want to return to the status quo of our sham of a marriage, but I need to work on myself, and our lives are nearly 700 miles apart. And yet, we could work through anything if you loved me. There was a question in his dark eyes. One Jill wasn't ready to answer. Jill entered the commercial kitchen at the retreat with leaden feet. Oh, she'd put on a smile for her quilting guests in the dining hall. But inside, she was torn. If only I hadn't wanted so desperately to go to the senior prom. If only I hadn't woken up in a hotel room all alone with no clear memory of what happened after the dance. If only I'd been able to face the Salazar's threats of taking Teddy away from me alone. If only, if only, if only. It was all spilled milk. Jill was who she was, a woman afraid of intimacy with a man. And on a normal day, she was okay with that. But this hadn't been a normal day. Glamma was going to need more care, more rest, more watching over. And that responsibility would fall on Jill and Annie. Not to mention, Jill was once more in the market for someone to clean rooms and help with meal prep and service. One step forward always seemed to put her 2 steps back. Jill heaved a sigh and consulted the menu posted on the wall behind the door for tonight's meal. Salad, 2 kinds of lasagna, vegetable medley, garlic bread, and chocolate cake. I miss Glamma already. A bit of colorful sparkle caught her eye. Jill looked around the kitchen, jaw-dropping. She'd entered in a demoralized daze. She hadn't noticed the red, white, and green garland framing the window over the kitchen sink, or the Christmas-themed tea towels hanging from the oven towel racks. There was a small, fake tree on the table in the corner with colorful, blinking lights. It was topped with a gold star that had shooting stars sparkling above it. And the ornaments. Jill moved closer. They were gnomes of all shapes and sizes, some made of fabric, some of wood, a few of plastic. Vince had listened to her brief lament about wanting a gnome-themed tree. Jill's eyes filled with tears. And she wished, oh, how she wished, that she could be a woman deserving of Vince's love. Why are we in this guest room? Teddy was still grumpy after their argument. Despite Vince apologizing and assuring him that he'd do everything in his power to spend Christmas with him. Mom calls this the worst room in the retreat. It does have a grim vibe. Until now, Vince had been in every occupied room in the railroad stop retreat except this one. And although the rooms he'd cleaned were dated and in need of a refresh, this room looked as if it had been lifted from a boarding house 100 years ago. The bed's headboard was made from unfinished logs. Small pieces of bark had fallen on the pillows. The framed photographs in the room featured emaciated-looking miners, faces and clothing smudged with dirt, their expressions grim. The bathroom was painted black, perhaps to match the black toilet, shower, and molded sink. Or perhaps the fixtures had come first and the paint afterward. Someone was proud of this room once, Vince said, half under his breath. Mom said her other grandma used to live in here. Teddy hadn't entered the room proper. He lingered near the door. I barely remember her. Mom offered it to Glamma once, but even I can see this room isn't for her. Yeah. Vince couldn't picture Jill's larger-than-life grandmother in here either. I think we should give this room a new look. You're braver than I thought, Dad. Will you help me? Vince turned to Teddy. When you aren't at soccer practice or doing homework, that is. Mom doesn't let me paint. Teddy's lower lip thrust out. She says I'm better at pulling weeds than painting. Ouch. Vince let his gaze roam the room once more while he replayed Jill's words in his head. Make the rooms social media worthy. Honestly, the last time I painted had to be grade school, and it was a sheet of paper, not a wall. But I'm willing to try if you are. He could do an online search for how to paint an interior wall. How hard could it be? What do you say? Teddy blew out a breath. Okay, I suppose it can't look any worse than it already is. Truer words have never been spoken. Vince hesitated, then laid his arm over Teddy's shoulders. Have you seen the big kitchen this afternoon? No. Teddy took hold of Vince's hand near his shoulder and snuggled closer beneath Vince's arm. If I go in the kitchen after school, I have to help make dinner, and I'd rather do homework. Despite the impulse to encourage Teddy to be more helpful, Vince didn't say a word. In fact, he didn't dare move for fear of destroying this rare and precious moment beside his son. I tried to do something nice for your mom in the big kitchen. Teddy perked up. Did she like it? I don't know. I haven't seen her since. His thoughts drifted. We kissed and she closed herself off from me. Hurry up, Dad. Teddy slid from under his arm, grabbed his hand, and tugged him along the balcony toward the stairs. If she likes it, maybe she won't divorce me. Joy to the world, the water is boiling. Jill sang along to the tune on her phone but changed the words. She set the steamer basket above the boiling pot of water, then covered it with a lid. Someone's in a good mood, Vince said, having entered the kitchen without her hearing over the rapidly boiling water and the blaring Christmas music. Mom, we never do Christmas in the kitchen. Teddy looked around in awe. I wondered why Dad was buying all those holiday decorations. He said it was for a surprise. Surprise, Vince said, looking adorably shy. Jill's smile felt as if it was permanently embedded in her cheeks. It was a wonderful surprise. Thank you. What can we do to help with dinner? Vince came to her side and kissed her cheek. Yowzer. Not in front of the baby, Teddy teased, his face redder than the tomatoes in her green salad. You can begin taking food out to the serving table. She handed Teddy the largest salad bowl. You know the drill. Teddy looked put upon. And make sure the beverage table is refreshed. I know. Jill put a hand on Vince's arm, holding him back when he might have taken the other salad bowl, and followed Teddy. Thank you. I needed this today. She pointed around the room at all the Christmas cheer. Vince looked torn. Even if I'm part of the reason you're sad, she nodded. The song switched to All I Want for Christmas Is You, and if Jill had been braver, she might have serenaded Vince. She laughed. Vince raised his brows. Did I miss the joke? I was just trying to imagine me at any age singing out loud to the boy I had a crush on. She chuckled. I couldn't imagine it. Why not? You were singing to a pot of boiling water a minute ago, Vince teased, resting his hands on her hips. Jill's cheeks heated, and not because his touch made her uncomfortable. If you're trying to dare me to sing to you now, you've got the wrong girl. Oh, I think I've got the right girl, those words, spoken so softly. Jill's breath caught, and she I want our marriage to be real, a loving partnership. Am I the only one working today? Teddy asked, kitchen door swinging behind him. A timer went off. The bread's done, and the vegetables would be done steaming soon after. We'd best get to work then. All smiles, Vince turned and went to work, but much of his work was already done, in her heart. There's a Christmas market next weekend in the town square, Jill said to Vince after Teddy had gone to bed that night, right before Christmas. They sat on the living room sofa, splitting a second piece of chocolate cake. The lights were low, the Christmas tree was cheery, and Jill was feeling the same. I love Christmas markets, Vince said. Jill nudged his shoulder. You do not. You're not the type to indulge in Christmas. Back in school, I couldn't even get you to wear an ugly Christmas sweater. He leaned away from her, fake frowning. Back then, I wasn't confident enough to wear an ugly Christmas sweater to school. Does that mean you've worn an ugly Christmas sweater in your lifetime? Because he seemed incredibly confident now. Well, no. Laughter burst from Jill, laughter like she hadn't known in months. I know what I'm going to wish for this Christmas. Seeing you in an ugly Christmas sweater, the Grinch would be appropriate. Or maybe a lump of coal. Hearty har. Vince set the cake plate on the coffee table. Isn't it enough that I wore a hoodie with dress slacks? That's a fashion faux pas. Maybe you aren't as confident as you appear. And wasn't that an interesting notion? Don't you ever just want to wear grubby sweats and ratty old t-shirts? No, Jill gave him an incredulous look. The Vince Patrizio you saw when we were in high school is as low as I go. Khakis and polo shirts. He tugged at the shoulders of his dress shirt. This is my casual now. Growing up, blue jeans weren't allowed in the casino penthouse, and certainly not t-shirts. Doesn't that make you feel uptight? Vince shrugged. Sam says I'm tightly wound. That's just who I am. Jill glanced around her small home. It wasn't decorated for his level of dress. Are you having trouble picturing me here? Vince asked, worry in his tone. She shook her head. I've seen you here. You are here. You and your designer duds. She grinned. And I couldn't be happier. Vince leaned over and rested his head on her shoulder. She'd noticed his fancy hair product in the shower, but she hadn't opened the cap. His hair smelled good. He smelled good. I think I'm ready for my goodnight kiss, Mr. Patrizio. Vince stilled. I'd like to kiss you goodnight, Mrs. Patrizio. Slowly, he sat up, connecting his gaze to hers. There was heat there, just for a moment in those dark, expressive eyes, enough to set her heart to pounding, in a hybrid mix of apprehension and longing, before he blinked and contained it. He'll always let me set the pace. And with that in mind, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was the first time she'd initiated a kiss between them. There was that now familiar simmering heat. But there was also a feeling of giddiness, a release of fear. At least enough that she could slide her hand to the nape of his neck and tangle her fingers in his hair. She'd never dared do that before, not even this afternoon out on Parish Hill. I want this feeling of being normal, of being loved. Vince's arms came around her, and he drew her into his lap, one arm around her torso, one arm around her legs and hips. It should have felt romantic. Jill felt trapped. Her body tensed, as if preparing for flight. No. She squeezed her eyes shut. It wasn't fair. She couldn't remember the attack, but her body knew and had set up defenses. Slowly, she became aware of Vince easing his hold, of his gentle touch. His hand stroked her hair. His lips brushed her cheek while he whispered soothing messages. You're safe. You're okay. You're safe. You're loved. Jill lifted her head, meeting Vince's gaze, feeling embarrassment heat her cheeks. It's not fair. It's not fair to me. It's not fair to you. She scrambled off Vince's lap. You need to sign those divorce papers. He deserved a wife who wasn't broken. And then Jill spun around and headed for her bedroom. I can't do that, sweetheart. His voice sent shivers down her spine. And you don't want me to. He's right. That didn't mean it wasn't wrong to stay in this marriage. Jill entered her bedroom, closed the door, and leaned her back against it, wishing, if only, if only, if only. Chapter 11. The days fell into a predictable kind of rhythm as Christmas approached, one that Jill began getting used to. She and Vince worked together to juggle Teddy's needs and activities, taking turns picking him up from school and taking him to soccer practice. Vince had torn apart and emptied the worst room on the property. He and Teddy considered it their project and had banished Jill from entering. Deliveries arrived every day. Packages for Vince. Jill joked that they were filled with more clothes. Vince didn't rise to the bait. Teddy speculated they were Christmas gifts. Boxes piled in a corner in Teddy's room. Some were carried to the guest room Vince and Teddy were working on. The pair showing up for dinner with paint-stained clothes and hands became a common occurrence. Guests checked out. Guests checked in. Glamma wasn't allowed back to clean, so Vince took over her duties. He helped Jill cook meals for guests and sometimes made meals for their small family unit. Occasionally they held hands. Occasionally they exchanged a tame goodnight kiss. It felt as if they were both waiting for something to happen, something that would make their marriage real or tear it asunder. "The DNA results are in," Vince told her one night after Teddy had gone to bed. As expected, Teddy is Brian's. Instead of breaking down in tears, Jill had snuggled closer to Vince on the couch while they discussed when and how to tell Teddy who his biological father was. Jill wanted to put it off, and despite disagreeing, Vince had honored her wishes. One night, while at Teddy's soccer practice, when Jill was bundled in a jacket and knit cap and huddled beneath a thick, fuzzy blanket, one of the parents asked, "Were you and your husband separated for long?" Jill froze, licked her lips, and searched for an answer. "I only ask because Teddy watched him so intently when your husband first started coming." The woman was bundled the same way Jill was, her nose red from the stinging cold. "But he seems to be more trusting that his father is here to stay. I hope everything works out for you." "Thanks," Jill managed to say, happy for Teddy. "I'm Tara, Coach Carl's ex-wife." Jill made sympathetic noises before introducing herself. "We've been going to family counseling, and I was wondering." Tara gave Jill a searching look. "Did you go to counseling?" "No." Jill's answer was a wisp of air. "I've been thinking about it, though, for myself because, well, somewhere along the way I lost myself." "Jilly." Tara nodded. "With the right therapist, it can't hurt." The conversation stuck with Jill long after she and Teddy were back in Harmony Valley. After Teddy went to bed, Jill told Vince about Tara's compliment regarding Teddy's progress around Vince. "He's convinced you're not going anywhere." "I'm his dad. It says so on his birth certificate, remember?" That was Vince's way of diverting the conversation away from the topic of the future. "Did she say anything else? You seem preoccupied tonight." "No, nothing else. Nothing that Jill was ready to discuss. She'd do her homework and find a therapist specializing in issues like hers, and then she'd discuss things with Vince, if he was still around. It's pink." Teddy stared around the former worst guest room at the retreat. Or at least, Vince hoped their efforts had elevated the room's status. "Yep, it's pink, and we both know this because we painted it pink, and not a tame pink. It was a highly saturated hot pink that Barbie would be proud of." Vince turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. They'd painted the bathroom pink with bright white trim, which actually made the black tub, sink, and toilet look like an intentional design choice. They'd painted 3 of the 4 walls in the bedroom pink. The baseboards and the small antique dresser were now a bright white, and if upon close inspection you could see brush or roller strokes, well, they'd done their best. The log headboard was gone. In its place was a white wicker headboard. The bedspread was a pale eyelet pink with pillowcases and lined curtains to match. Glamma had donated a big white feather fan which they'd affixed over the headboard. And the remaining wall, Vince went over to run a hand across the bold pink daisy wallpaper. "I hate wallpaper," Teddy said, falling back on the bed. "I hate wallpaper paste." "But you don't hate this room anymore, do you?" Vince reached over to ruffle Teddy's hair. "It doesn't give you the creeps." "It's a girl's room, Dad." "That it is." And it was social media worthy. Footsteps sounded outside on the balcony, leading their way. "They're here." Vince caught Teddy's hand and helped guide him to his feet. "They better like it," Teddy muttered, "'cause we're not repainting or removing that wallpaper." "What's this about a room remodel?" Glamma appeared in the doorway first, watching her step as she crossed the threshold, and then she looked up. "Oh, goodness gracious." She took a few more steps in. "There's my fan, last used on stage at the Tropicana." She nudged Vince's shoulder. Annie appeared next, eyes widening as she entered. "This is a choice." "Pink," Teddy muttered. And finally, Jill came into the room. Her jaw dropped, and then she laughed. She laughed so hard she collapsed onto the hardwood floorboards. "It's great," she managed in between laughter. "It's just a choice," Annie said again. "Well done." Jill nodded, laughing so hard that tears spilled onto her cheeks. Vince was just relieved they seemed to like it. "Welcome to the glamour room," he said with a flourish. Teddy smirked. "We're only renting it to someone who likes pink." Jill laughed even harder. "I thought your girlfriend gatherings happened on Sundays." Vince fussed with the set of his coat collar, stopping on the walk leading to Glamma's house. Jill took pity on him and straightened his collar. He seemed tense. He'd buttoned his coat all the way up. She stared up into his dark, worried eyes. "Wine Sundays don't have to be on Sunday. This is just a casual gathering of friends." "I'm confused too, Dad." Teddy rang the doorbell. "It's Thursday night, a school night, and Mom made me change into an ugly Christmas sweater. One covered in the faces of dogs wearing Santa hats. It's a night when we don't have guests at the retreat," Jill added, taking Vince's hand and leading him up the walk. She hadn't had time to change out of her jeans and holiday sweater either, this one featuring Mrs. Claus. "You'll be fine. They'll like you." "Promise?" Vince murmured. "Promise." Jill drew him down for a quick buss of the lips, surprising herself with the action. "It's just a gathering. We haven't gotten together in a few weeks. You're not on display here." Maddie opened the door, then shouted over her shoulder, "He's here." She disappeared. Vince gave Jill an incredulous look. "He's here?" Teddy charged after Maddie with a war cry. "Let's get this video game tournament started." Several young voices chattered and laughed. The kids were probably in Glamma's room, and her grandmother was no doubt with them, eschewing wine and girl talk. "Is Sam here?" Vince followed Jill over the threshold. "Didn't he leave to follow a lead on a runaway in Sacramento?" Jill started to remove her coat. Vince helped her out of it, hanging it on a hook by the door. Heaven only knew where Teddy had flung his jacket. "Here's the man of the hour. I'm Corey." She approached with a glass of wine in each hand. She wore a red sweater dress, and her hair looked attractively tousled. "What's your preference, a Harmony Valley Merlot or a Harmony Valley Chardonnay?" Behind her, Mina followed with a tray of appetizers. Her long, dark ringlets fell over the shoulder of her burgundy blouse. She looked all business if you didn't count that gotcha grin. "I'm Mina, and I have to warn you that we've got plans for you, Vince." But first, Annie swept past them both, handing Vince and Jill a pair of wine charms, one that said his and one that said hers. She smoothed the skirt of her black cocktail dress. "We're going to ply Vince with food and wine." "A wise strategy before interrogating the enemy," Vince said, regaining his footing, although he hadn't removed his coat or closed the door behind them. "You're not the enemy," Jill reassured him, "although I didn't get the memo that we were dressing up tonight." Vince heaved a weary sigh. "I thought you'd all be in ugly Christmas sweaters." Corey laughed. "Not for the meet and greet for the famous or infamous husband of our beloved Jill." "Take your coat off, Vince." Jill shut the door and then went to stand between Vince and what felt like an evil coven. "Looks like I'm the only one who's going to be underdressed this evening." She sent each of her friends a death glare. "Thanks, girls. Way to be supportive." Behind her, Vince sighed again. That poor man. There was the sound of a coat being removed, and then her three best friends all burst out in laughter. "What is wrong with you?" Jill demanded, turning to take Vince's hand and apologize for the ambush, only to find Vince wearing an ugly Christmas sweater. Jill began to chuckle, and then to laugh. And then she reached for Vince for the second time in 5 minutes to buss his lips. "You're perfect." His sweater was green and featured none other than the Grinch. Vince stared into Jill's eyes tenderly, making her wish they were alone in their ugly sweaterness. There was a chorus of feminine sighs behind Jill. Vince's smile broadened into a confident, sexy expression. "Corey, I'll have the chard. Mina, I'll pass on appetizers. And Annie?" He finally tore his gaze away from Jill, presumably to find her cousin. "Annie, the next time there's a dress code, if you don't let us know, there will be payback." Jill hugged him, squeezing as if she never wanted to let go. Chapter 12. The Christmas market wasn't what Vince had been expecting. Saturday morning, Harmony Valley's town square was lined with booths and tables, filled to bursting. Christmas music played somewhere. Ugly Christmas sweaters abounded. I've done my duty in that department, and he'd won over Jill's circle of friends in the process. There was everything under the California sun on display at the Christmas market. Taxidermy, antiques, quilted and knitted goods, a cat adoption table, baked goods, children's crafts, pictures with Santa, and Christmas decorations. Lots and lots of Christmas decorations, including small bags of mistletoe, of which he'd purchased one. Vince and Sam followed Jill, Annie, and their grandmother through the rows. Teddy had free rein to run around the town square with his friends. That would never happen in Vegas. If they'd been at an event like this in Vegas, Vince would have watched Teddy like a hawk to make sure he was safe. "How's it going at the retreat?" Sam stopped at a table with jars of honey and homemade jelly, right before a group of children swarmed past. He wore a well-worn pair of blue jeans and a tan Vegas Golden Knights hockey sweatshirt. No ugly holiday sweaters for Sam, but he'd never be a fashion plate. He wore a black Raiders baseball cap over his mirrored sunglasses. "Annie told me you remodeling a room and started on another." "Say what you mean, Sam." Vince pinned him with a stare over the top of his sunglasses. After days of demolition and painting, he'd donned a nice pair of black dress slacks, a gray cashmere sweater, and a leather jacket. But his clothes weren't changing his mood for the better. "You don't care about my painting skills." On the drive into town in Vince's Ferrari, he'd noticed a stripe of lavender paint beneath his thumbnail. Worse, there'd been a paint drip in Teddy's hair, but his sloppy painting technique didn't matter now. Best friends aren't supposed to prevaricate. "You want to know how it's going with Jill? You can just ask." "I was trying to give you space to talk to her about Vegas, but given how prickly you are, I think I have my answer." Sam purchased a small jar of honey. He took his time putting his change in his wallet. More kids raced around them. Sam looked a bit pale. Kids and crowds triggered his PTSD. He walked over to the wrought iron bench beneath the large, spreading oak tree and sat down, hopeless and heaven. Vince sat next to him, then clapped a hand on Sam's shoulder, hoping to ground his friend in this moment rather than letting him drift into the past. "That's the range of my emotions on the daily. Is that what it was like with you and Annie when you were trying to work through the obstacles your relationship faced?" "I had to step up and be a better man." Sam lowered his baseball hat brim as more kids passed by, laughing and chattering. "I am stepping up." He'd gotten up every morning to make Jill coffee before heading over to make breakfast for the guests. He turned over the rooms and did piles and piles of laundry. He helped make meals. He drove Teddy to soccer practice. He juggled responsibilities at the Bella Vista and those of being a dad. Vince was working just as hard as Jill, and oddly enough, he was loving it. And as for his relationship with Jill, and we've settled into a rut. And Vince wasn't certain Jill was going to demand he sign those divorce papers when they broke out of it. Teddy ran past in blue soccer pants and a black railroad stop retreat hoodie. There was still a drip of paint in his hair. "Hey, Dad." I don't think I'll ever get tired of hearing that. It made discovering paint in places it shouldn't be that much easier to bear. Maddie, Annie's little girl, slammed into Sam, a candy cane in one hand and a brownie in the other. She wore a red velvet Christmas dress with red and white striped leggings. "Hey, Sammy, don't forget that I love you." She scampered after Teddy. "Ain't love grand?" Sam didn't look up, but he smiled. "Some days I believe that more than others." A slender, elderly woman danced over to them, like a Broadway chorus girl twirling to a stop in front of their bench. "It's Sam and Vince, too. Merry Christmas." Vince nodded. He'd heard his share of nicknames this week. "Merry Christmas, Rose." Sam glanced up at her and then at Vince. "Vince, too?" "I decided on Vinny." Mrs. Claus rolled up with her bright red walker, Her soft blue sweater deserved respect since Santa was driving a sports car on the front. He dresses like a rock star. Did you get new glasses, Mildred? Sam leaned back to give Vince a once-over. If you're going with Vinny, I'd say he dresses like a mobster. He plucked at Vince's leather jacket. Vince rolled his eyes. He's Vin. The elderly pixie approached them next. Her holiday sweater was gold with red poinsettia leaves that curled out of the sweater front. Don't you think Vin fits him, Sam? Choose your answer carefully, Sam. Vince smiled at the trio. Merry Christmas, ladies. Agnes, I think we'll stick with Vince, Sam said, grinning. What are you ladies shopping for? Oh, we're not shopping. Mildred patted her snowy white curls. Agnes plucked Sam's bag from his hands and inspected his honey jar. We finished our shopping months ago. She returned it to him. Rose did a little jig, incredibly spry. We're here to cheer on the school choir. They perform in an hour. And we're looking for Glamma. Mildred straightened her thick as a cell phone glasses. Agnes nodded. She's been feeling down. Have you seen her? Rose bounced up to her toes and scanned the area. Vince pointed toward the row Teddy had disappeared down. They went that-a-way. The trio left Sam and Vince with calls for a Merry Christmas. Vince, too. Sam chuckled. Vince's cell phone rang. Here's my daily call from my grandfather. We won! The old man was chuckling. We won! The Salazar case? Vince grinned, but then he realized with a court order to shield Teddy, Jill had no need to be married to him. It's Saturday. The case was decided on Saturday? No, that Declan Detmeyer won for us, but as they were reading the ruling, he got word that his wife was in a car accident. His grandfather's tone had turned grim. Spent all night in the ER. She's in intensive care, and he just remembered to call. That's great. Vince still had mixed feelings, but it was the result he'd been hoping for. A pair of snare drummers marched by, making enough noise that further phone conversation wasn't possible. Vince thanked his grandfather for the call, then elbowed Sam. Why don't we walk over to that Mexican restaurant? Beer and nachos sound good, don't they? Good enough to celebrate. Plus, there'd be fewer children to trigger Sam's PTSD. The two men made their way to the edge of the town square, then crossed the street toward the restaurant. There was a lot of foot traffic. A few vehicles were approaching from the other end of Main Street. Sam's stride became more confident. Whatever name you go by, you'll always be my number one. Careful, Sam. Vince slapped him on the back. You're making me blush. They both laughed. A big black truck pulled up next to them. The driver's window rolled down. Sam kept on laughing, perhaps even harder. Are you Vince, too? The driver could have been Vince's cousin, black hair, black eyes, a knowing smile. Yeah, that's him, Sam sniggered. I'm Vince 1. He extended a hand toward Vince. Nice to finally meet you. Vince gamely shook hands. Given our resemblance, we're lucky they aren't calling us Thing 1 and Thing 2. Vince 1 laughed. Welcome to Harmony Valley. I've got just one word of advice for you. What's that? Vince asked, genuinely curious. Don't fight the horseradish. Vince 1 drove away, leaving Vince flabbergasted and Sam still laughing. Look at these clothespin doll ornaments. Jill picked up one that resembled a Disney princess in a satiny blue dress. Aren't they sweet, Glamma? I think you have a dress like this. I don't remember. Glamma was lower emotionally than Jill had ever seen her before. She'd worn her favorite holiday dress to the Christmas market, a black and red tartan dress with flowing sleeves and skirt. But her blonde hair was lackluster and her makeup minimal. I've seen that dress of yours, Glamma. Annie joined them at the display table. She wore a tan, ugly Christmas sweater with dangling knit candy canes over bright pink leggings. Maybe I'll wear it on Christmas Eve. Oh, those were fighting words. Glamma didn't loan out her dresses, not even to her granddaughters. Glamma sighed and turned away, only to be waylaid by a trio of her elderly friends, Agnes, Mildred, and Rose. Christmas greetings were exchanged, and then the women drifted off. Annie watched them go. She's refusing to take the medicine. I know, I'm worried about her. Jill refused to allow her back to work until she went on meds. She set the blue doll ornament down and was going to walk away, but a pink one caught her eye. She picked it up. I got married in a pink wedding dress. It hadn't been this pretty, but it had been the closest thing to white she'd owned back then. You could renew your vows in a pink dress. Annie touched a clothespin ornament painted like a tin soldier. Jill held on too tight to the clothespin princess, pressure building in her chest. The pressure to be a wife in more than name. Jilly? I'm not Jilly. Jill set the pink ornament back on the display. But you want to be. Annie looped her arm through Jill's and guided her back into the flow of shoppers. Do you remember when you first bought the motel from your parents? How they clung to running it in the dark ages? Of course. They were still taking reservations on the phone with a one-page website. Jill blew out a breath, tense just thinking about it. They did their taxes by hand and sold individual rooms rather than renting the place out to groups. But you had the vision to make a motel in the middle of nowhere into something different, something better, and you did it. Annie brought Jill closer. You didn't like the school system on the other side of Parish Hill, and you found there were other parents living on that side of the summit who felt the same way, but who couldn't drive their kids to school in Harmony Valley and make it to work on time on their side of the summit. So you organized parents and got school bus service out there. Is your point to remind me how tiring it is to get things done? Jill said, half joking. The point is, Jill, that you built the life of your dreams by yourself. Annie lowered her voice, as if sharing a secret. But you didn't do it overnight, so if Vince is the man of your dreams. They reached the end of the row, slowed by traffic. Jill wished Teddy's teacher a Merry Christmas. I understand what you're saying, Annie. Marriage is hard work, and an ideal marriage doesn't blossom overnight. This is where I give you a list of cliches. Annie paused to check out the kittens up for adoption. You've got to want it, Jill. You've got to want it more than the status quo, and then you've got to take that journey one step at a time. Like signing up for therapy. Thank you for repeating every pep talk I've ever given myself on this issue. Jill admired a calico kitten with sleepy eyes. I love you, Jilly. Annie gestured to Felix, the retired fireman who ran a cat rescue. I think Glamma might perk up if we got her a kitten. Jill started to laugh, but then she heard a raspy voice, one from her worst nightmares, say, There she is. Jill turned to find the Salazars approaching her with their lawyer. She clutched Annie's arm. Where's Vince? But more importantly, where was Teddy? Chapter 13. Ladies, I'm afraid I'm not in the Christmas spirit today. Glamma turned to face Agnes, Mildred, and Rose on the far corner of the town square, intending to walk home and wallow in self-pity. Oh, we're not here to encourage you to revel and sing. Mildred turned her walker in a small circle, then dropped the seat and sat on it facing Glamma. Although you are dressed for a role in a choir, Agnes fingered Glamma's red and black tartan skirt. Her short, white hair was thinning on top. Not a Victorian choir, maybe a Scottish one. Do the Scots have a choir, Rose? Not that I know of. Rose crossed her arms over her skinny chest and peered in Glamma's face, an action that was very un-Rose-like. She was a flitter, a woman who rarely could be still. Are you in there, Glamma? They know I'm losing my mind. This was worse than being called Gloria by a young pup of a doctor. Glamma drew herself up in a regal pose and then gave Rose the stink eye. I'm right here, Rose, and I'm hurt you would suggest otherwise. Rose tapped her chin with one finger, not the least bit intimated by Glamma. I tend to believe her. I appreciate the vote of confidence, Glamma sniped. Now, if you'll excuse me, what does the doctor have you on? Rose asked. She rattled off a word with too many syllables, none of which seemed to go together. That's what I'm on. Keeps me grounded. As much as Rose can be grounded, Mildred said softly. Rose turned Mildred's way, scoffing. I only meant that you go through life with a ballerina's wings, Mildred said in a mollifying tone. True. Rose pivoted back toward Glamma. So, what drugs are you on? Agnes grabbed hold of Rose and Glamma, drawing them closer to whisper. Lower your voice. People are going to think the worst of Glamma. Drug addict. Rose smoothed her white chignon. Not a good look on anyone. I just want to go home, Glamma said in a brittle voice. Do you know where that is? Rose asked. Girls, we should follow her to be sure. Mildred dutifully began the slow process of getting to her feet, pushing up using the arms of her walker. Is this going to be my life now? Constantly chaperoned? Doggedly tracked? Glamma silently counted to 10, and then she drew a deep breath and said, I'm not taking any medication. Meds made my husband a shell of a man in those final years, and I'm not doing it. I used to be like you, Rose said, still in her un-Rose-like mode. You might remember that I handcuffed myself to the bench under that oak tree over there once, and destroyed a float for a parade. Mildred sat back down in her walker. She generally turned into a harpy, Agnes added. Nobody likes a harpy. Rose harumphed, sticking her nose in the air. Although we did stick by her, Mildred said, conciliatory once more, as good friends do. Agnes rubbed Rose's back. What we're trying to say, Rose raised her voice, clearly upset, although not nearly as upset as Glamma was. Yes, let's wrap this up. It's dangerous to you, to those you love, and to your happiness if you don't at least try what the doctor recommends. End of intervention. Rose took a bow. And since my share isn't welcome, There she is, someone shouted. Glamma turned to see who'd made a fuss and saw a woman in a fancy pantsuit and low, square heels bearing down on Jill. Chapter 14. We've got to move. Sam tossed some bills on the bar in the Mexican restaurant. That was Annie on the phone. Vince took a sip, his third of his ice-cold beer. But our nachos haven't arrived. And move Marine, Sam barked, attracting the notice of everyone in El Rosal. The Salazars are on the town square looking for Teddy. Vince went cold, then hot, but he obeyed his sergeant and beat Sam to the door, even with his limp. They ran across the street, heads on the swivel, stopping on the edge of the rows of Christmas vendors. Where are they? Vince couldn't see Jill or Teddy, Annie or Glamma. Someone shouted on the other side of the town square. They raced up the middle row, dodging people and shouting out that they should move, move, move. There! Vince saw them first. Jill stood facing Brian's parents, her chin held high and her mouth moving, dropping words Vince couldn't yet hear. The Salazar's slimy lawyer stood a few feet behind his clients in his ill-fitting suit. He was sharp-eyed, looking through the crowd for someone. Teddy. Vince ran faster, but not fast enough. Teddy appeared, squirming through the gathering crowd to reach Jill. No. Vince's heart dropped. The truth. They hadn't told Teddy the truth, and the Salazars weren't the kind to hold it back. Nobody needed to learn they were a product of rape from a stranger. Vince's leg was throbbing, his heart was pounding, but nothing was going to stop him from reaching his family and protecting his son. Vince burst into the circle of onlookers just moments after Teddy did. He moved to stand between Jill and Teddy and the parents of Jill's attacker. Now isn't the time for this. Sam entered on his six, crossing his arms and giving the Salazar party a dark look. Mrs. Salazar tugged on the lapels of her pantsuit jacket and fixed Vince with a disparaging stare. The DNA proved what we knew all along, that your son had no interest in being a father, Vince said in a loud, hard voice, channeling his grandfather. He glanced over his shoulder at Jill. Get Teddy out of here. He turned back to the Salazars when Jill and Teddy left. We're not here to kidnap anyone, Mr. Salazar said, looking as teary and broken as he had the day of Brian's funeral weeks back. He was in his 60s and looked puffy, as if he was retaining water. His wife scoffed. Don't go soft. That's our grandson. She stole him. The audience gasped. There were several cell phones out. This was turning into a social media sensation. Teddy didn't deserve to see this the rest of his life. What's all the fuss about? Before Vince could chastise the filmers, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a blue flannel checked shirt entered the fray. I'm Sheriff Nate Landry, and it's my job to keep foot traffic flowing at the Christmas market. He waved an arm, instructing folks to move on, focusing more on crowd disbursement than the argument that gathered a crowd to begin with. Cell phones lowered. Space around Vince felt less claustrophobic. She's stealing him again. Mrs. Salazar's voice was high-pitched and panicked. She tried to push past Vince. Teddy, stop. Jill didn't steal anything. Vince took hold of the older woman's arms. You lost in court, Mrs. Salazar. Because of what your son did, you have no right to visitation. She refused to back down, struggling to move. My client isn't here for visitation. The lawyer stepped up, immediately blocked by Sam. We happened to be at the same event as the boy, and decided it would be a gesture of good faith to introduce ourselves. Vince swore. That's a stretch. I hate lawyers, Sam said, taking a step toward the attorney. Or should I say liars? The man swallowed and moved several steps back. Vince released Mrs. Salazar. She stumbled, twisting her ankle in those low heels. Swearing again, Vince righted her. Sam, what's the problem here? Sheriff Nate returned his attention to their fracas. Who do I need to arrest? Arrest? I could learn to like this town. Even the horseradish. Vince smiled. It was over. Teddy would need comforting, but hopefully no permanent damage had been done. These three, Sam began, glancing around. Where Mr. Salazar go? Jill had hold of Teddy's arm and was run walking to a side street off the town square, trying to remember where they'd parked when she heard him. Mrs. Patrizio. A man's voice, wheezy, pleading. Jill didn't know if it was Brian's father or the lawyer the Salazars had brought. She didn't slow, but Teddy did, glancing over his shoulder. Mom? Don't encourage them. Jill broke into a jog, but she was in flight mode, gasping for breath. A stitch formed in her side. I need to exercise. Mrs. Patrizio, Jill, please. No. There was her SUV, just 3 cars ahead. Teddy glanced back. Mom, maybe we should talk to him. It's just the old guy, not the scary old lady. Jill sobbed, stumbled, nearly brought them both down, and Teddy, bless Teddy's heart, he steadied her, stood in front of her, placed his hands on her shoulders. Mom, it's going to be all right. No. Jill shook her head. She wanted to say, you don't know these people. They wanted to buy you. She wanted to say, I can't protect you. Vince can't protect you. What she did say was, run, in a hoarse voice, choked with sobs. Teddy shook his head once more, looking older than his years and ready to face the hard stuff head on. I'm not running. That's what you do. He really is Vince's son. Where else would he have learned to handle himself with such perseverance and grace? Thank you for stopping. Mr. Salazar wasn't giving up, but neither was Jill. She turned, trying to stand in front of Teddy, but her son was having none of it. He stood at her side. Mr. Salazar sagged against the cab of a parked truck. I'm sorry. His round face was red, and he sucked in air worse than her vacuum when it was full. It was my wife's idea. Please. Jill choked back over a decade of fear and vulnerability, trying to find her strength to stand her ground. This isn't the place to talk about this, not in front of Teddy. It's all right, Mom. Teddy turned sideways and hugged Jill, his chest to her shoulder. And then he whispered, I've known for a while that I'm not a biological Patrizio. Jill stiffened, not breathing. How long? Had Vince told him? Did he know the worst of it? A long, long time, Mom. I overheard you talking at a wine Sunday. And then Teddy turned to Mr. Salazar and walked toward him, back straight, head high. He stopped a few feet away. I know my mom dated your son, but she married my dad. Jill covered her mouth with her hand, holding back a sob. Is this my little boy? He sounded so firm, so grounded. I don't know you, Teddy continued, except by your threats to my mother. You've tried to fight over me like a video game on Black Friday, and maybe you thought that was the only way to see me, and maybe someday. And here what had sounded like a well-rehearsed speech faltered. Teddy started again. And maybe someday I might consider some kind of relationship with you, but not now, and never like this. You've been cruel. You've been cruel to my momother. At his stutter, Jill rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her son. That's enough. Teddy's head was bowed and he was silently crying. You got what you wanted, Jill said to Brian's father through a fog of tears. Please go. Mr. Salazar nodded, straightened, sniffed. You've done a good job, Jill, better than we deserve. You don't deserve anything. Jill guided Teddy away from the man and toward their SUV. I love you so much. I'm so proud of you. She repeated it over and over again all the way home. After returning from the Christmas market, Vince spent his afternoon taking care of his family, alternating between prepping food for Jill's guests and sitting on the couch between Jill and Teddy, his arms around them. It was bad, an emotional low, but it could have been worse. Teddy didn't seem to know the circumstances of his conception. He seemed to assume Jill and Brian had been dating when he'd been conceived. Vince's cell phone rang. It was his grandfather. Much as he didn't want to be disturbed, he had to answer. I just heard from Declan, who received a formal apology from the Salazar's lawyer. Why didn't you call me? His grandfather shouted. You should have called the moment you laid eyes on them. Vince had been too busy trying to control the situation, but there was no arguing with him when he cycled up like this. Grandpa, this is a bad time. Can I call you back? Vince smoothed Jill's hair. You should have called me or our counsel right away. His grandfather was fully down the rant track. His Italian accent was pushing its way into his syllables. There was no way to stop him at this point. Vince muted the phone and set it on the coffee table, not bothering to put it on speaker. My grandfather called to ask if you and Teddy were okay. His grandfather's rant continued in a tinny voice. That's my great-grandpa? Teddy started to laugh. He's got a temper. He's all bark, no bite. Jill began to laugh-cry. Vince held on tighter to both of them. Raised you. And this. There was a sound of something falling, a shattering of glass, and a clatter. Grandpa? Vince grabbed the phone. Grandpa, are you okay? You're still muted. Teddy took hold of his phone and tapped the screen, unmuting. What's happening? Vince demanded. Sir, your grandfather has collapsed. That was Chester, his grandfather's weekend companion and bodyguard. Blakely is administering CPR. I need to call 911. We'll call you back. And then the line went dead. For the second time that day, Vince's heart dropped. I have to go. But he didn't move. I have to go, he said again, imagining it was too late for goodbyes. Jill got to her feet and helped Vince up. You've got to go. And then Teddy was by his side, helping Vince into his bedroom. What do you need to take with you? You. Jill. Nothing. Vince looked around the bedroom. He imagined this was the last time he'd see it like this, filled with race car and superhero comforters. He turned to Teddy. Could it be he'd grown since Vince arrived nearly 2 weeks ago? It felt like he had. You're growing up so fast. And not just physically. Teddy nodded. You shouldn't have to. Vince pulled him into a fierce hug. I called Sam. Jill entered the room. He's going to drive you to the airport. Vince released Teddy and drew her into his arms. Thank you. He released her, knowing he needed to go, but he stared at Jill, imprinting her features in his head, even as his mind went through loose ends. And then Vince sighed. Can you two? This is going to sound weird. He tried to smile, thought about his grandfather collapsed on the penthouse floor, failed at smiling and cleared his throat. Can you just give me a minute in here, alone? Sure. Jill rubbed his arm. Teddy nodded. They left the room and closed the door behind them. Vince had his things stacked in a corner. Although they weren't all his things. There were gifts there. For Teddy, for Glamma, for Jill. All wrapped and stored in a large cardboard box. And resting on top of the box was a manila envelope, the one containing Jill's divorce papers. Jill and Teddy waved to Vince as Sam drove him away. The rumble of Sam's truck engine receded, giving way to the wind whispering through the pines. He's not coming back, is he? Teddy asked in a hollow voice. No. Jill could barely squeak the word out. He knew it too, didn't he? Teddy asked, voice dropping down to a whisper. I think so. Tears were spilling over Jill's cheeks. She tried to sling her arm over Teddy's shoulders, but he was too tall. She laugh-cried. Am I standing in a hole? You're not even 12. You can't be taller than I am. Mom, Teddy rolled his eyes. I was going to tell Dad today that I outgrew my soccer cleats. Makes sense that if my feet shoot out one way that my head would shoot up another. Jill was flabbergasted. You outgrew your new cleats? The ones your dad just bought you? Yeah? Teddy rubbed a hand over his dark brown hair. He'd wanted to grow it out to be more like Vince's. Sorry. That's okay. Jill felt pummeled by everything that was happening today. As long as you don't ask me to call you Ted, at least not today, I don't think I could handle any more surprises today. Teddy nodded, opened his mouth, hesitated, and then said, I like a girl. Jill started to laugh. You had to do it, didn't you? You had to tack on something else. Yeah? He laid his arm across her shoulders. How much longer are we going to stand here? Just until we're sure he's gone. Jill choked up again, sniffed, blinked back tears with little success. This is all my fault. Mom, Jill heaved a sigh. If I never sent him those divorce papers, I wouldn't have fallen in love with him again. Teddy nodded slowly. Yeah, but then I wouldn't have had the chance to fall in love with him, like ever. Jill forced out a brief chuckle. If this is what you're like at 11, almost 12. God, help me when you're 18. Teddy gave Jill a side hug and then headed for home. Should I remind you that you got married when you were 18? No. Jill followed him a few feet before stopping and looking down the driveway, and then a flash of red caught her eye. The sun glinted off Vince's red Ferrari. He left his car. Jill hurried inside, heart lighter. But it was still empty, and she thought it might be for a long, long time. Possibly forever. Chapter 15. Vince sat vigil at his grandfather's hospital bed. Grim. It was a grim vigil. He'd lost track of how long he'd been here. The doctors said he'd suffered a heart attack. Help had come quickly, but his bodyguard had given him chest compressions that had broken ribs. Luckily, his grandfather's lungs hadn't been punctured, but his body had taken a big hit, and the pain meds coming through his drip kept him semi-conscious. At some point, his grandfather had opened his eyes and said, "Vincenzo," in a heavy Italian accent, but he'd fallen back into slumber. Vince's head felt heavy, his eyes gritty from lack of sleep, and just as he was starting to doze, his cell phone vibrated. He'd set it on the bedside table, screen up. Reminder, you have a son named Teddy in Harmony Valley. Vince squeezed his eyes shut, but that didn't soothe the pain in his heart. In the hallway, someone called out, "Merry Christmas." There was laughter and excited voices. It was Christmas. He needed to wish Jill and Teddy a Merry Christmas. Except he didn't want to call during his big Christmas surprise. And he didn't want to call because after saying Merry Christmas, he didn't know what else to say. "I love you." That was a given. "I wish you were here." He couldn't say that. He'd given up the right. So instead of opening the drapes, he laid his head on his hands on his grandfather's hospital bed. "Mom, there's a bunch of really big trucks outside." Jill removed the last of the bacon from the pan on Christmas morning. "Are they delivery trucks?" They had no guests and weren't expecting any until tomorrow. "Nope." "Please tell me it's not the Salazars." Jill drew a deep breath. She couldn't think any vehicle pulling into the retreat from this point on was the Salazars. That wasn't healthy. They're setting up some weird machine in the parking lot. Jill came to join Teddy at the window in his room. Unlike other Christmases, they hadn't leaped out of bed and tore into their presents. They'd decided to savor this holiday. But in reality, they were both hoping that Vince would show up to save Christmas. Fat chance of that. Sam had told them Vince's grandfather had yet to be moved from intensive care. Vince was where he was needed most. She couldn't fault that. Outside, the men started an engine. They swung a large pipe attached to the bulk of the truck around, a pipe aimed toward the sky. The engine shifted gear. Something shot out of the pipe. "That's snow!" Teddy looped his arm around Jill's shoulders. "Dad made it snow on Christmas. I only told him I wished it would snow that one time." Jill started to cry. She'd been doing a lot of that lately, crying at the mention of her husband's name. "Is it bad to say I'd rather have him here?" Teddy shook his head. He felt that way, too. "Take a picture of his car. It's getting snowed on." Oh, he'd hate that. Jill took a picture, but she couldn't bring herself to send it. "Merry Christmas, Vince," she said instead. "Merry Christmas, Dad." Teddy laughed, a deeper sound than his childhood chuckle. "It's going to take a long time to finish making that snow. We have a big yard." Good thing they brought 2 trucks and 2 sleds, which they'd already set on the sidewalk. They grinned at each other, and then said in unison as they ran into the living room, "Let's open presents." They retrieved the 2 gifts under the tree. Teddy tore open her gift to him. New cleats! She'd driven into Cloverdale yesterday to find them. Jill tore open Teddy's gift to her. A new ugly Christmas sweater. This one had a Christmas tree with blinking lights. Dad helped me pick it out. Of course he had. They admired their gifts without much enthusiasm. Jill thought about Vince wearing the Grinch sweater to meet her friends. She slapped the sofa cushion. "Do you want to open Dad's gifts to us?" "Heck, yeah!" Teddy disappeared into his bedroom, returning with 2 wrapped gifts, one very big and one small. Teddy placed the big box on the coffee table. "Dad said this is really from Great-Grandpa Patrizio." Jill opened the box. It's a Christmas village. It looked antique, not made of resin like hers. A family heirloom. Jill thought she might cry again. Teddy tore into his box. "It's a phone. Oh my gosh, my own phone." "Of course he bought you a phone. Classic cliché dad gift. You're too young for a phone." But after his behavior at the Christmas market, she didn't protest as much as she might have. "Dad didn't think I was too young." Teddy found the gift tag, which had neat writing on it. He laughed. "He's apologizing for not teaching me how to ride a bike." That brought on more silence. "I suppose we should get dressed and enjoy the snow." It was in the high 30s this morning. The snow wouldn't last long. "Not yet. There's this." Teddy handed her a manila envelope, looking like he might cry. The address on the front was Vince's in Las Vegas. I don't want that. Jill sat on her hands. You don't have to, Teddy said in that grown-up voice of his. I looked. Teddy? Jill's shock lasted about 2 seconds. They were in this together, after all. Did he sign them? Tell me he didn't sign them. He signed them, Teddy whispered. It's over. It's really over. And that's when the anger kicked in. For the first time that morning, Jill moved with a purpose, leaping off the sofa and hurrying toward her bedroom. Let's go outside and pelt his car with snowballs. Someone had their hands in Vince's hair and was giving the strands a good, hard tug. Vince startled awake, drool on his cheek. Merry Christmas, his grandfather said in his gruff voice, emphasized by a gentle nudge on Vince's head with his knuckles. Vince sat up and rubbed the back of his head. You were pulling my hair. Better than pulling your leg. His grandfather's wan smile was brighter than any set of lights on the strip. I called your name a couple of times. He reached for Vince. Can't seem to fill my lungs without feeling like a pincushion pierced with pins. Vince took his grandfather's hand, felt the strength in his grip, and knew they were over the worst of it. Tell me what I missed, his grandfather said weakly. Not now. You need to rest. There was no argument. The old man had already closed his eyes. Love and happiness, Jill muttered, getting into the hospital elevator on New Year's Eve afternoon. What was that? Teddy asked, pushing the elevator button. It's a mantra. Love and happiness. Jill drew a deep breath. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparations, culminating in a flight to Las Vegas this morning. Is that something you say a bunch of times until it comes true? Yes, Jill faced Teddy. How do I look? Great, Teddy's cheeks turned ruddy. You don't look like the woman who runs the railroad stop retreat. Is that what you want to hear? Yes, exactly. Annie, Corey, Mina, and Glamma had helped with makeup and wardrobe, a black business suit with black heels for this meeting. She clutched a manila envelope in her hand. You look handsome too, Teddy, in his suit and tie. Tell me again how you promised not to tell your father we were coming. I didn't tell him we were coming. Teddy mumbled something about parents being weird. I wished him a Merry Christmas on my new phone. I shouldn't have told you that much. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a quiet corridor. Here we go. Jill marched down the hall as if she owned the place. In fact, that was practically true. Her grandfather-in-law had donated money to build the cardiac wing of the hospital. It was named after him, Aldo Patrizio, Vince's grandfather. This is it, Teddy stopped. Jill drew a deep breath. Let's go get him back. Teddy nodded, for good this time. They entered the hospital room in a unified front, only to find Aldo Patrizio half naked in the midst of a hospital gown change by a male nurse. I'm out. Teddy bolted back to the hallway. Ack, sorry. Jill backed out, shielding her eyes. She stumbled into a firm chest and glanced over her shoulder. Vince? She'd expected to see him coming, not going. Happy New Year. He greeted her in kind, his smile tentative. He looked haggard. I was down the hall in the waiting room while they gave him a good scrubbing. I'm not the feature in a public car wash, Aldo called from his hospital bed. Close the door on your way out. Calm down, Vince said, smile growing. No one gawked or took a picture. He caught Teddy's eye as he shut the door. Did they? Dad jokes. Teddy flung himself into Vince's arms. I missed you. I missed you too, son. Vince held out an arm toward Jill, an invitation to join them. Jill made it a group hug. She had so much to say, so much she'd rehearsed. But right now, the hug was what she needed. A nurse poked her head out of a room, seemed to recognize Vince, and then gave them a wave. We need to keep the hallway quiet. Vince hustled them to a waiting room. And then he faced them, expression turning somber. He gestured toward the manila envelope. You could have hired someone to serve me papers. I assumed you've had them recorded. Vince glanced at Teddy. Did you grow again? Teddy grinned. I think so. You shouldn't have given Teddy a cell phone for Christmas, Jill blurted, although she hadn't meant to. Stick to the script. Vince's smile was warm. How could I give your grandmother a cell phone and not my son? He's got a point, Mom. Teddy hadn't stopped smiling since Vince's appearance. They were getting off track, but Jill couldn't resist adding, he likes a girl, Vince, and now he has a cell phone. Oh, that changes everything. Sobering, Vince held his hand out toward Teddy. Give it back. Dad? I'm kidding. Vince sighed. I'm so glad to see you both, but you still want to divorce us because you can't figure out how to take care of your grandfather and his dreams, and us and our dreams. This was it. Jill stood taller in her heels, taller than she'd ever stood, because for once, the future wasn't looking like a minefield she had to cross without a map. There will be no divorce. We've figured it out. What happened to negotiation? Vince teased, although he looked doubtful. It was there in the half-smile. If he believed their relationship was possible, he'd have been grinning. Have faith. Fear of losing him again tried to weaken Jill's knees, but she clung to her determination. Setting the manila envelope on a nearby chair, she took Teddy's hand and then Vince's. Huddle up. Vince caught on and completed the circle, taking Teddy's hand. Okay, present your terms. We've brought a prospectus of the railroad stop retreat because we'd like you to buy it. Jill tugged Vince's hand when he opened his mouth to say something. And by you, we mean you and your grandfather as an extension of the Bella Vista portfolio. And then, there's more? Vince asked, but with a twinkle in his eye. And then, Jill repeated, suppressing the urge to smile, we'd like to propose that you and your grandfather make Harmony Valley your headquarters. Vince's jaw legitimately dropped. You can run the Bella Vista from Harmony Valley, Teddy said, not without some urgency. He was nervous, too. You already have been. Jill nodded, since Vince still seemed to be in a state of shock. And your grandfather will have you, us, and a very welcoming community. If he can stomach horseradish baking, Teddy interjected, fidgeting. To give him purpose every day, Jill finished. We know this offer is out of the blue, but... She and Teddy exchanged smiles. We love it. How did you come up with this idea? Vince asked, finally finding his voice. Well, we put our heads together. Jill tilted hers toward Teddy's. As we do. Teddy tilted his head toward hers. Great minds think up great thoughts. Jill straightened, squeezing Vince's hand, heartened that he hadn't poked holes in their vision. Also, we realized that your grandfather took on our legal defense with an energy and enthusiasm that rejuvenated him. Until he had a heart attack, Vince said slowly. Jill waved off his protests because they'd thought about that too. The result of years of a rich lifestyle. What he needs now is a slower pace, better food, and... family. Teddy grinned. What do you say, Dad? Can we pitch our idea to great-grandpa? Mom shaved her legs and everything. Teddy. Jill chastised, but half-heartedly. I'm in, Vince said slowly, carefully, if you two fulfill one request. They stared at him, eagerly awaiting his condition. Well, Vince asked, rolling his eyes. Catch up, isn't it obvious? They shook their heads. He fed them their lines. I love you, Dad, Teddy said dutifully, giving him a high five. I love you, Vince, Jill chimed in, popping up to kiss his cheek. You should have led with that love stuff, Vince said, drawing them in for another group hug. And later, after Aldo had been dressed, presented, and accepted their proposal, not without a requisite amount of grumbling first, Teddy asked for time alone with his great-grandfather. Jill led Vince eagerly into the hallway. What's the rush? Did you want a kiss to seal the deal? Vince said playfully, easing his arms around her waist. Yes, but first. Jill pressed her fingers to his lips. I want you to know that I signed up for therapy. And I want you to come too, because I want to be your wife, and that's enough for me. And Vince kissed her. He kissed her tenderly and sweetly, and with a promise of many tomorrows. Jill eased back to look at his dear face. I love you, Vince. Vince kissed her forehead. But I loved you first. Epilogue. Christmas morning was different for Vince this year. He wasn't sleeping in a hospital chair. He wasn't afraid that the happiest days of his life were behind him, and he wasn't worried his grandfather was going to die. He stumbled out of the bedroom he shared with Jill, yawning and stretching, intent upon grinding beans to make a fresh cup of coffee. He turned on the kitchen light and was suddenly blinded by pink. Pink balloons, pink ribbons, a pink banner stretched across the kitchen window. It's a girl! Surprise! Jill hurried out to give him a hug, belly first. She was 4 months along. Therapy was still ongoing, but they were a work in progress. Surprise! Teddy sat up on the brown couch, filming Vince with his cell phone. He had a bruise on his cheek from a soccer game a few days earlier. Vince's bad leg twinged. He held on to Jill to stay upright. What a Christmas gift. Wait until we tell my grandfather. The old man was living in a remodeled guest room downstairs and had made many friends in town, although he probably didn't count Horseradish as one of them. And Glamma. She was on her meds and back to work at the retreat, giving his grandfather a run for his money. But our sonogram wasn't scheduled until January. Jill hugged him and apologized. Remember how I didn't feel good a few days ago, and the doctor had me come in for an office visit? Vince nodded. He'd been taking care of business in Las Vegas. The doctor took my blood and ordered a sonogram, and we're having a girl. Vince drew her back into his arms. Are you disappointed? Jill asked carefully. They gave me pictures and a video to share with you. As long as she's healthy, I don't mind. Vince pointed at Teddy. You're going to be a big brother. Teddy hadn't stopped filming, which should have been a red flag. Well, here's the thing. Jill laid her hand on Vince's cheek, the one with the scar his father had given him. We're having twins, Teddy cried, spilling the beans. Vince's legs threaded to give out once more. He leaned on Jill. He'd probably always lean on Jill. Dad? Teddy asked, still filming. Vince? Jill asked, concern lining her brow. Say something. Okay, he smiled at them. He smiled down to his toes. We're going to need a bigger house.